Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're cracking open the British monarchy's most carefully guarded secret. And no, it's not about hidden treasure or secret heirs. Think you know British royal history? Think again. Behind those stiff portraits and formal chronicles, there's a whole parallel story of passionate friendships, controversial favourites, and relationships that made the court gossips work over time. We're talking about monarchs whose letters got mysteriously edited, princes whose scandals got buried under layers of euphemism, and relationships that everyone at court knew about but nobody dared write down directly. Before we dive in, hit that like button if you're ready for the real story and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? So dim those lights, get comfortable and prepare yourself. Because tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtain on 25 royal figures whose true stories have been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Ready to meet the kings and princes history tried to forget? Let's begin. So let's start where all good royal scandals begin, in the medieval period, when record-keeping was selective at best and chroniclers had to get creative about how they described certain relationships. Because here's the thing about medieval historians. They saw everything, they wrote down most of it, but they had to use a very particular vocabulary to discuss matters that the church considered, shall we say, theologically problematic. Think of it as the original don't ask, don't tell policy, except everyone was definitely asking and the chroniclers were definitely telling, just in code. The medieval court was a fascinating ecosystem of power, intimacy, and carefully managed appearances. Kings didn't just rule, they performed kingship, and part of that performance involved surrounding themselves with favourites, advisors, and companions who wielded enormous influence. Sometimes these relationships were purely political, sometimes they were deeply personal, and sometimes they were both, tangled together in ways that made later historians deeply uncomfortable and reach for their editing pens. What's particularly interesting is how the same behaviours got described completely differently, depending on whether the king in question was popular or not. A beloved monarch had close companions and trusted advisors. An unpopular one had corrupting influences and unnatural attachments. Same relationship, different PR team. Now, before we dive into specific stories, we need to talk about how medieval people thought about these relationships, because it's not quite what you might expect. The medieval world didn't have the same categories of identity that we use today. There was no concept of being gay or straight as orientations, those are modern inventions. What they cared about was behaviour, specifically certain acts that were considered sinful regardless of who was committing them. But here's where it gets interesting. The line between passionate friendship and something more was deliberately kept fuzzy. Medieval culture celebrated intense same-sex friendships. Men could share beds, exchange gifts, write passionate letters, and swear eternal devotion. And this was considered not just normal but actually virtuous, up to a point. Where exactly that point was? Well, that's where things get complicated and where chroniclers started deploying their creative vocabulary. Let's talk about Edward II, because if there's one medieval English king whose personal life has been dissected, debated and dramatised more than any other, it's this one. Edward became king in 1307, inheriting the throne from his formidable father Edward I, also known as the Hammer of the Scots, also known as a man who would have been deeply disappointed in what happened next. Edward I had been the epitome of medieval warrior kingship, tall, commanding, militarily successful, the kind of king who inspired fear and respect in equal measure. Edward VI was not that, not even close. From the moment of his accession, Edward II made it clear that his priorities were somewhat different from his father's. Traditional medieval kingship demanded that a monarch surround himself with powerful nobles, distribute favour strategically, and maintain at least the appearance of being above personal attachment. Edward II threw that playbook out the window and instead elevated a single individual to a position of such spectacular prominence that it scandalised the entire kingdom. That individual was Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight who had been part of the royal household during Edward's youth. The two had become inseparable, and when Edward became king, he made sure everyone knew it. The first thing Edward did, and I mean literally one of his first acts as king, was recall Gaveston from exile. His father had banished Gaveston specifically because he was worried about the young man's influence over his son. Edward I had looked at their friendship and thought, this is going to be a problem. He was not wrong. Edward II brought Gaveston back, showered him with titles and lands, and made him Earl of Cornwall, which was traditionally a title reserved for members of the royal family. The message was clear. Gaveston wasn't just another court favourite. He was being treated as though he were royalty himself. The English nobility, unsurprisingly, were not thrilled about this development. Here was this foreign knight, not even from a particularly important family, suddenly outranking earls whose ancestors had been in England since the Norman conquest. The optics were, shall we say, not great. But Edward wasn't done. He went to France for his marriage to Isabella, daughter of the French king, and he left Gaveston as regent in his absence. Let that sink in for a moment. The king left his favourite, not a senior nobleman or a member of the royal family, in charge of the entire kingdom while he went to fetch his bride. And then, at the wedding celebrations, Edward allegedly paid more attention to Gaveston than to his new queen, giving him gifts that were meant for Isabella, and generally behaving in a way that made the French court raise their collective eyebrows. Isabella's father reportedly complained, and Isabella herself, who was only 12 at the time because medieval royal marriages were delightfully problematic in multiple ways, was apparently confused about why her husband seemed more interested in his friend than in her. The chronicles from this period are absolutely fascinating in how they describe the relationship between Edward and Gaveston. They use phrases like immoderate love, beyond measure and reason, and, my personal favourite, the king loved him dearly with all his heart and above all others. That last one comes from a chronicle called the Vita Edwardi Secundi, written by someone who was alive during these events and presumably knew what he was seeing. The word choices are deliberate. Medieval chroniclers had an entire vocabulary for describing appropriate male friendship, and they knew exactly how to deploy it. When they started using phrases like immoderate and beyond measure, they were signalling that this had crossed whatever line existed in their minds between acceptable and problematic. Other sources are even less subtle. The French chroniclers, who had fewer reasons to be diplomatic about an English king, were more direct. One described how Edward delighted more in the company of Gaveston than in that of any mortal man. Another noted that their affection was excessive and indecent. These weren't casual observations. Medieval chroniclers generally gave kings the benefit of the doubt, because criticising a monarch could be hazardous to one's health and career prospects. When they started using words like indecent, they were making a deliberate choice to preserve for posterity that something about this relationship was, in their view, crossing boundaries. The English barons certainly thought so. They forced Edward to exile Gaveston multiple times, and each time Edward either found a way to bring him back or was openly miserable until he could do so. The letters between them during periods of separation are remarkable. Edward wrote to Gaveston addressing him as his dearest brother, promised him anything he desired, and generally sounded like a man desperately in love, which didn't exactly help with the rumours. Unfortunately for Gaveston, the barons eventually decided that exile wasn't a permanent enough solution. In 1312, a group of nobles captured him and executed him without trial, which was both illegal and a pretty clear statement about how they felt about the situation. Edward's reaction to Gaveston's death was, by all accounts, one of complete devastation. He withdrew from public life, refused to eat, and when he finally emerged, his desire for revenge against the nobles who had killed his favourite dominated his political agenda for years. This wasn't the reaction of a king who had lost a useful political ally. This was grief, deep and personal and all-consuming. The chronicles note it. The letters document it. Even Edward's enemies acknowledged it. Whatever the exact nature of their relationship, it was clearly the defining emotional bond of Edward's life up to that point. Now you might think that Edward would have learned something from this experience, perhaps that elevating a single favourite to heights that offended the entire nobility was politically unwise. You would be wrong. Enter Hugh Despenser the Younger, who became Edward's new favourite and managed to be even more unpopular than Gaveston, which is honestly impressive. Despenser was English nobility, which should have made him more acceptable to the barons, but he was also spectacularly greedy, politically ruthless, and apparently determined to accumulate as much power and wealth as possible while he had the king's favour. Edward gave him lands, titles and influence that made Gaveston's position look modest by comparison. The chronicles describe their relationship using similar language to what they'd used for Gaveston: excessive attachment, immoderate favour, the king being bewitched by Despenser. That last term is particularly interesting because it removes agency from Edward, while still acknowledging that something unusual was happening. It's the medieval equivalent of I'm not saying it's definitely witchcraft, but I'm not saying it. The relationship with Despenser lasted longer than the one with Gaveston, partly because Despenser was more politically skilled, and partly because Edward was by this point king and had more power to protect his favourite. But it ended just as badly. When Edward's wife Isabella, remember her, the queen who had been largely ignored in favour of the king's favourites, invaded England with an army, One of her primary stated goals was removing Despenser from power. She succeeded. Despenser was captured, subjected to a show trial, and executed in a particularly gruesome manner that I won't detail here because this is supposed to help you sleep, not give you nightmares. Edward himself was forced to abdicate and died in captivity under circumstances that remain suspicious. The question of what exactly these relationships were has occupied historians for centuries. Were Edward and Gaveston lovers in the physical sense? What about Edward and Despenser? The honest answer is that we can't know for certain, and anyone who tells you they know definitively is overstating the evidence. What we can say is that these relationships were emotionally intense, that they were the defining features of Edward's reign, that they were described by contemporary observers using language that signalled something outside the norm, and that they ultimately contributed to Edward's political downfall and death. We can also say that later historians have bent over backward trying to explain them as purely political or purely friendly, which tells us more about those historians' discomfort than it does about Edward's actual relationships. The way Edward II's story has been told and retold over the centuries is its own fascinating study in historical interpretation. Victorian historians were deeply uncomfortable with the whole thing, and tended to emphasise Edward's political failures while downplaying the personal relationships or describing them as unfortunate weaknesses of character. Modern historians have been more willing to engage with the possibility that these were romantic or sexual relationships, though there's still significant debate. The evidence is fragmentary, the language is coded, and we're trying to understand intimate relationships from 700 years ago through sources written by people who had their own reasons for describing things in particular ways. It's like trying to understand someone's marriage by reading their divorce lawyer's court filings. You'll get information, but it's going to be filtered through a very specific lens. Now let's talk about Richard the Lionheart, because if Edward II's story is complicated, Richard's is even more so. Richard the Wall of England, also known as Richard Coeur de Lion, is one of the most famous medieval English kings despite spending very little time in England. He's the crusading warrior king, the hero of countless stories and legends, the king who gets romanticised in nearly every medieval adventure tale. He's also a king whose personal life has been the subject of intense historical debate for decades. The specific relationship in question is between Richard and Philip II of France, and it's documented in a chronicle written by Roger of Howden, a clerk in the royal administration who was actually present at court and witnessed events firsthand. According to Roger, when Richard was still just a prince and was staying at the French court, he and Philip ate from the same table and from the same dish, and at night the bed did not separate them. He goes on to say that Philip loved him as he loved his own soul, and that they had such affection between them that the King of England, Richard's father, Henry II, was worried about what it might mean politically. Now, before we go further, let's talk about what sharing a bed meant in medieval times, because this is important context that often gets lost. In the medieval period, sharing a bed was common and didn't automatically imply anything sexual. People shared beds for warmth, because beds were expensive and private space was limited, and because ideas about privacy were very different from modern ones. Important guests would often share the host's bed as a mark of honour and trust. So the fact that Richard and Philip shared a bed isn't by itself unusual. What's unusual is that the chronicler specifically mentions it and frames it within a description of their exceptional affection for each other. He's signalling that this was notable, that it meant something beyond standard diplomatic friendship. The phrase "loved him as he loved his own soul" is particularly interesting because it's biblical language. It echoes the description in the book of Samuel of the relationship between David and Jonathan, which medieval people would have recognised immediately. That biblical friendship was held up as the ideal of virtuous same-sex love, but it was also a relationship that people debated even in medieval times. The text says that Jonathan's love for David was wonderful, passing the love of women, which gave medieval theologians and scholars something to think about. When chroniclers used that language to describe contemporary relationships, they were invoking that whole complicated tradition. They were saying this was friendship of the highest order, but they were also maybe saying something more, leaving the interpretation carefully ambiguous. Roger of Howden also notes that Henry II was worried about the closeness between his son and the French king. Now, Henry had plenty of political reasons to worry. Richard was in rebellion against him at various points, and Philip was supporting that rebellion, so a close personal bond between them was genuinely concerning from a political standpoint. But the way the concern is described, the emphasis on the personal nature of the relationship, the specific details about eating and sleeping arrangements, suggests that Henry's worries weren't purely political. It's the kind of detail you include when you want to convey that there was something unusual happening beyond just political alliance. After Richard became king and went on crusade, he and Philip fought constantly and eventually became enemies, which happens with a lot of intense relationships whether they're romantic or not. Their spectacular falling out actually makes interpreting their earlier closeness more difficult. Were they lovers who had a bitter breakup? Were they friends whose political interests diverged? Were they young men caught up in the intensity of youth who grew into different roles as adults? All of the above? The sources don't give us enough detail to say for certain, and the nature of medieval chronicle writing means we're always getting information filtered through the chronicler's perspective and agenda. What makes Richard's case even more complicated is that later in life he was accused by a priest of living in sin and was ordered to do penance. The specific sin isn't detailed in the sources, and historians have debated endlessly about what exactly was being referenced. Some have argued it was about his relationships with men. Others have argued it was about heterosexual relationships outside of marriage. Still others have suggested it was a more general accusation of sinful living that wasn't about sexuality at all. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous, which hasn't stopped people from making confident claims in all directions. There's also the question of Richard's marriage to Berengaria of Navarre. They married in 1191 during the Crusade, and by all accounts it was not a particularly warm relationship. They spent very little time together, produced no children, and after Richard's death Berengaria had to fight for years to get the money she was owed as Queen Dowager. Victorian historians use this as evidence that Richard was clearly devoted to his crusading ideals and just wasn't interested in marriage. Modern historians have pointed out that having a distant political marriage doesn't tell us much about anyone's personal life or orientation. Lots of medieval people had arranged marriages that were unhappy or unconsummated while having fulfilling relationships elsewhere, both heterosexual and homosexual. The debate about Richard's sexuality has been remarkably heated for something based on such fragmentary evidence. Some historians have strongly argued that Richard was gay, pointing to the relationship with Philip, the ambiguous penance, and the distant marriage. Others have strongly argued that there's no good evidence for this, that the Philip relationship was just intense medieval friendship, and that we're reading too much into sources that don't actually say what we think they say. Both sides have accused the other of either projecting modern categories onto the past, or being homophobic in their interpretation. It's honestly become one of those historical debates where the passion invested in the argument sometimes seems disproportionate to the actual evidence available. Here's what we can say with reasonable confidence. Richard had an exceptionally close relationship with Philip Thent when they were both young, close enough that a contemporary chronicler noted it in terms that signalled it was remarkable. Whether that relationship was romantic, sexual, or intensely platonic, we can't determine from the available sources. Richard later did penance for unnamed sins. He had a distant relationship with his wife and produced no legitimate children. These facts exist. How we interpret them, and whether we connect them into a coherent narrative about Richard's personal life, is where historians disagree, and that disagreement is as much about our own time's assumptions and categories as it is about the medieval evidence. What's particularly fascinating about both Edward II and Richard III is how their stories have been told differently over time. For centuries, the unusual aspects of their personal relationships were either ignored, explained away, or used as evidence of character weakness. The Victorians, in particular, tied themselves in knots trying to explain away sources that seemed to suggest physical relationships between men. They'd translate medieval Latin terms in ways that softened the implications. They'd emphasize political explanations for everything, and they'd generally do whatever they could to preserve these kings as heterosexual figures who just maybe had some poor judgment about who they chose as advisors. Modern historians have been more willing to discuss the possibility of same-sex relationships, but there's still significant debate about how to interpret the evidence and whether we're being appropriately cautious about not imposing modern categories on medieval people. It's a legitimate methodological question. How do we talk about people from a time period that didn't have the same identity categories we use today? Is it anachronistic to call a medieval king gay when that term and concept didn't exist in their time? Or is it actually more honest to acknowledge that same-sex desire and relationships have existed across all time periods, even if the language used to describe them has changed? The chroniclers themselves were dealing with a similar problem, which is why their language is so interesting. They had to describe relationships and behaviours that they saw at court, but they had to do so in ways that navigated church teaching, royal power, and their own potential legal liability. The result was a complex vocabulary of suggestion and implication. When a chronicler said a king's love for someone was immoderate or beyond measure, they were making a specific claim. When they compared a friendship to that of David and Jonathan, They were invoking a rich tradition that their audience would understand. When they noted details like bed sharing or gift giving in particular contexts, they were providing clues about how to interpret the relationship. Later editors and translators sometimes obscured these clues, either through ignorance or deliberate choice. Medieval Latin has terms that can be translated multiple ways depending on context and the translator's assumptions. A word that could mean lover might get translated as friend. A phrase that suggests physical intimacy might get rendered in ways that sound more chaste. Chronicles got edited, and sometimes the more suggestive passages were removed or altered. Letters were lost or destroyed. The result is that we're often working with incomplete sources that have been filtered through multiple layers of interpretation, each layer reflecting its own time's assumptions about what was possible or acceptable. This is why the study of these medieval relationships requires such careful attention to language and context. We have to read the sources in their original languages, understand the vocabulary chroniclers were using, know what they could and couldn't say directly, and recognize when they're being deliberately ambiguous or suggestive. We have to understand medieval friendship culture, which celebrated intense same-sex bonds but also drew lines that seem fuzzy to us now. We have to grapple with our own assumptions and biases, recognizing when we might be seeing what we expect to see rather than what the sources actually say. The Chronicles were written by educated clergy who were steeped in biblical and classical traditions. They knew the stories of passionate same-sex friendships from antiquity, Achilles and Patroclus, Orestes and Pylades, Alexander and Hephaestion. They knew the theological debates about the relationship between David and Jonathan. They knew how to signal to educated readers that a relationship was in that tradition. At the same time, they had to be careful. Directly accusing a king of sodomy could be dangerous. Being too explicit about royal sexuality could have consequences. So they developed this careful language that said enough for people to understand, but not so much that they were making actionable accusations. When we read that a king loved someone beyond measure and reason, we're reading a signal. When we read that affection was immoderate or excessive, those words had meanings. Moderation was a key virtue in medieval thought. To be immoderate was to be out of balance, to let passion overcome reason. When a chronicler said a relationship was immoderate, they were making a judgment about the nature and intensity of that relationship. They were saying it had gone beyond what was appropriate or normal. Whether that meant it had become sexual, or just that it was politically unwise, or both, was sometimes left deliberately vague. The phrase unnatural also appears in some chronicles, though more often in later descriptions than contemporary ones. This was more serious. Unnatural had specific theological implications. It suggested behaviour that violated natural law as understood by medieval Christianity. It was the language of serious sin. When later writers described historical figures' relationships as unnatural, they were making a strong claim. But we have to be careful about whether we're reading contemporary sources or later interpretations, because the language got stronger over time as the relationships got judged more harshly by later generations. What's important to understand is that medieval people saw behaviour on a spectrum of sinfulness, not identity as a binary. The question wasn't is this person gay or straight, but are these acts sinful? And different acts had different levels of sinfulness, and context mattered, and there was actually more room for ambiguity than you might expect. Two men having an emotionally intense friendship that involved physical affection like embracing or kissing. Perfectly fine, celebrated even, as long as it didn't cross certain lines. Where exactly those lines were, that's where things got complicated and where you needed plausible deniability. This is why kings could have favourites and write them passionate letters and shower them with gifts and sleep in the same bed, and all of this could be publicly known and discussed, and yet there was still this veil of ambiguity over what exactly was happening. Everyone knew, but nobody said it directly, and as long as nobody said it directly, the fiction could be maintained that this was just exceptional friendship. It was a social fiction that served multiple purposes. It allowed kings to have the relationships they wanted, it allowed the court to function without constant scandal, and it allowed the church to not have to confront uncomfortable questions about what to do when the king was arguably violating church teaching. But the fiction only held as long as everyone cooperated in maintaining it. When a king's favouritism became too obvious, too excessive, too damaging to the kingdom's governance, that's when the fiction broke down. That's what happened with Edward de Sceaux. His relationship with Gaveston and later with Despenser was so blatant, so all-consuming, so politically destructive that the nobles couldn't maintain the polite fiction anymore. They had to act, and they did. and Edward's inability or unwillingness to moderate his attachments contributed directly to his downfall. Richard I managed things differently. He was a successful warrior king, he went on crusade, he fulfilled the medieval ideal of kingship in ways that Edward the Sen spectacularly did not. Whatever his personal relationships were, they didn't prevent him from performing his role effectively. This meant that chroniclers could note his close friendship with Philip and still treat him as a proper king. The relationship didn't define his reign the way Edward's relationships defined his. This is part of why the historical debate about Richard is less settled than about Edward. Richard's success as a king made people more willing to give him the benefit of the doubt about his personal life. The pattern you see with these medieval kings is that their personal relationships became scandals, not just because of their nature, but because of their political consequences. A king who governed well could get away with a lot. A king who neglected his duties, who elevated favourites above established nobility, who let personal attachment override political judgment, that king was vulnerable, and his relationships became weapons his enemies could use against him. The chronicles reflect this. They're more critical of relationships when the king is failing in other ways, more willing to describe affection as excessive or immoderate when it's part of a broader pattern of poor kingship. This tells us something important about how medieval people thought about these relationships. It wasn't a simple binary of acceptable or unacceptable. It was contextual, political, and wrapped up in questions of governance and royal authority. The same relationship might be tolerated in one king and condemned in another depending on whether that king was otherwise successful. This is very different from how we tend to think about sexuality and relationships today, where we generally treat them as part of someone's identity regardless of their professional success or failure. So when we look back at these medieval kings and try to understand their relationships, we have to hold multiple things in mind at once. We have to recognize that the categories and language they used were different from ours. We have to understand that chroniclers were working within significant constraints about what they could say directly. We have to acknowledge that the evidence is fragmentary and often ambiguous. We have to be aware of how later historians have interpreted and sometimes distorted the sources. And we have to recognize our own biases and assumptions, both about the past and about how sexuality and identity work. What we can say with confidence is that medieval kings had intense, emotionally significant relationships with male favourites, that these relationships were noted and discussed by contemporaries using language that signalled they were remarkable, that some of these relationships were politically destructive, and that chroniclers developed a sophisticated vocabulary for describing them that walked the line between documentation and accusation. Whether all, some, or none of these relationships were sexual in nature is something we often can't determine from the available evidence, much as we might want to. But what we can see clearly is that these relationships mattered deeply to the people involved, that they shaped the political landscape of their time, and that their contemporaries understood them as significant enough to record for posterity, even when they had to be careful about how they did so. The medieval period gives us both more and less than we might want when it comes to understanding these royal relationships. More because the chronicles do document them and provide details that later periods might have completely suppressed. Less because the documentation is filtered through layers of political concern, theological constraint, and literary convention that make interpretation challenging. We're reading through a glass darkly, trying to understand intimate human relationships across a gulf of centuries and cultural change. Sometimes the picture comes clear, sometimes it remains frustratingly ambiguous, and sometimes the ambiguity itself is the point. These were relationships that existed in a space between definitions, acknowledged but unspoken, visible but undefined, and that liminal quality is part of what made them both possible and problematic in their time. Now, if you thought the medieval chronicles were creative with their vocabulary when describing Edward II and Richard III, just wait until we get to the kings who are explicitly called unnatural. Because here's where the gloves really came off. This wasn't the careful ambiguity of immoderate affection, or the biblical allusions to David and Jonathan. This was chroniclers reaching for the most damning language they had available, and in medieval Christianity, unnatural was about as damning as it got. The term carried enormous theological weight. It meant behaviour that violated the natural order established by God, acts that went against nature itself. When a chronicler called something unnatural, they weren't making a casual observation. They were invoking the entire framework of Christian teaching about sin, nature, and divine law. But here's the thing that makes this complicated and fascinating. Unnatural got weaponized. It became a political tool, a way to delegitimize kings who were unpopular or threatened powerful interests. And once you start paying attention to when and how the term gets used, you notice some interesting patterns. Kings who were militarily successful, politically stable, and kept the nobility happy could get away with all sorts of personal behaviour that would get other kings labelled as sinful or unnatural. But a king who was failing, who was making enemies, who was threatening the wrong people, suddenly his personal life became fair game, and chroniclers discovered all sorts of concerning unnaturalness that they felt compelled to document for posterity. It's almost like the unnaturalness was always a bit selective, depending on who was doing the accusing and what they stood to gain from it. Let's start with Richard II, because his story is like Edward Theone's, but somehow even more dramatic, which is saying something. Richard became king in 1377 at the age of 10, which meant he spent his formative years surrounded by regents and nobles vying for influence over him. By the time he came of age and started ruling in his own right, he had developed some very definite ideas about kingship, namely that he should be able to do whatever he wanted without a bunch of pushy nobles telling him what to do. The English nobility, having just lived through Edward II's reign, were not enthusiastic about another king who prioritised personal attachments over political wisdom. Unfortunately for them, that's exactly what they got. Richard's great favourite was Robert de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, and their relationship was close enough that it became the defining political problem of the Sarsnaistes. De Vere wasn't from nowhere the way Gaveston had been. He was English nobility from an old family. But Richard elevated him to absurd heights anyway, eventually making him Duke of Ireland, which was a newly created title that came with enormous lands and authority. The English nobles looked at this and thought, "Oh good, we're doing this again." They were not pleased. Richard didn't care. He showered de Vere with gifts, titles and influence, kept him constantly at his side and made it clear that de Vere's opinion mattered more to him than the collective wisdom of the entire nobility. The chronicles describe their relationship using language that should sound familiar by now. The Monk of Westminster wrote that Richard cherished him with such immoderate love that he held vigils through the night with him in a watching that led on to sleeping together. That's not subtle. The chronicler is telling us they stayed up all night together and then slept together, and he's framing it as immoderate love, which we already know is code for "this has crossed some lines." Another chronicle notes that Richard gave de Vere such privilege and familiarity that it was considered beyond the proper measure of friendship. There's that word measure again. Medieval people were obsessed with proper measure, with keeping things in their appropriate balance. When they said something was beyond measure, they meant it had become excessive and therefore problematic. What made Richard's attachment to de Vere particularly scandalous was that de Vere literally abandoned his wife to pursue a relationship with one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, and Richard supported this. He annulled de Vere's marriage, which was not a simple thing to do and required papal approval, and then stood by his favourite when the whole court was gossiping about the scandal. This wasn't just about Richard and de Vere's personal relationship. It was about Richard using his royal authority to enable behaviour that offended everyone's sense of propriety. The message was clear. De Vere could do whatever he wanted because he had the king's protection, and the king valued de Vere more than he valued maintaining good relationships with his nobility or upholding conventional morality. The nobles eventually had enough. In 1387, a group of powerful lords known as the Lords Appellant rose up against Richard, and one of their explicit demands was that Richard remove de Vere from his position of influence. They accused de Vere of treason, of corrupting the king, and of exercising undue influence over royal policy. Richard, demonstrating that he had learned absolutely nothing from Edward II's reign, tried to protect de Vere. He warned him to flee, and de Vere escaped to the continent where he lived in exile. Richard never saw him again. De Vere died in 1392, and when his body was brought back to England in 1395, Richard had the coffin opened so he could see his friend one last time. According to chroniclers, Richard held de Vere's hand during this viewing, which is either deeply touching or deeply weird depending on your perspective, and medieval people definitely found it weird. The language used about Richard and de Vere is interesting because it shifts over time. Early chronicles during Richard's reign are relatively restrained, talking about excessive favour and immoderate attachment. But later chronicles, written after Richard was deposed in 1399, become much more explicit and condemnatory. Suddenly chroniclers were comfortable saying that Richard's love for de Vere was unnatural, and that it had led to the corruption of the realm. Once Richard was safely deposed and couldn't retaliate, the chroniclers let their true opinions show, or at least felt free to repeat the rumours and accusations that had circulated at court. This pattern, where the accusations get stronger after a king loses power, is something you see repeatedly. While a king is reigning, chroniclers have to be careful. They can hint, They can use coded language, they can express concern about favouritism, but directly accusing a sitting king of unnatural acts is dangerous. Once that king is deposed or dead, though, the gloves come off. Suddenly all the things people whispered about at court make it into the written record, usually in harsher and more explicit terms. It's one of the reasons why sorting out what actually happened versus what was political propaganda is so difficult. The sources that seem most explicit are often the ones with the most reason to exaggerate or lie. But Richard II's story tells us something important about how these accusations worked. The nobles who opposed him didn't primarily object to his personal relationship with De Vere, though they certainly found it problematic. What they objected to was the political consequences, De Vere's influence over royal policy, his accumulation of wealth and power, Richard's unwillingness to listen to counsel from anyone except his favourite. The personal relationship became a weapon because it was visible, scandalous, and could be used to paint Richard as a king who let his personal desires override his political judgment. Whether the relationship was sexual, romantic, or just intensely emotional became less important than the fact that it could be characterized as excessive and unnatural, and therefore proof that Richard was unfit to rule. Now let's talk about William II, called William Rufus because of his red hair and ruddy complexion, because his court was apparently so scandalous that chroniclers were writing about it in scandalized tones a century later. William became King of England in 1087 after his father, William the Conqueror, died. He reigned until 1100, when he died in what was officially a hunting accident but was probably murder. Medieval hunting accidents had a suspicious tendency to happen to people who had made powerful enemies. During his 13-year reign, William managed to offend the church so thoroughly that clerical chroniclers basically competed to see who could paint him in the worst possible light. The thing about William Rufus is that most of what we know about him comes from sources written by monks and clergy who hated him. He spent his reign in conflict with the church over money, authority, and appointments, which meant that the people writing the history had every reason to make him look as bad as possible. And boy, did they commit to that task. According to clerical sources, William's court was a den of iniquity, characterized by long hair, fancy clothes, and behavior that made right-thinking Christians clutch their pearls. One chronicler described the courtiers as wearing clothes that were too tight, shoes with curved toes that looked ridiculous, and hair that was too long and too elaborately styled. The horror! Clearly the realm was on the brink of collapse because of inappropriate footwear. But beyond the fashion crimes, there were darker accusations. William of Malmesbury, writing a few decades after William Rufus died, claimed that the court was full of catamites and sodomites, that the king surrounded himself with effeminate men, and that the court had become notorious for sexual licentiousness of all varieties, but particularly the sort that involved men together. Orderic Vitalis, another chronicler, wrote that the effeminates set the tone for a whole kingdom, and that men adopted feminine manners and styles. These chroniclers were painting a picture of a court that had abandoned proper masculine behaviour and descended into unnatural practices, with the king either participating or at least enabling it all. Now here's where we have to be careful. These sources were written by clerical chroniclers who were ideologically opposed to William Rufus for reasons having nothing to do with his sexuality. He kept the Archbishop of Canterbury position vacant for years so he could pocket the revenue from the archdiocese's estates, which is the kind of thing that makes church chroniclers very angry. He taxed the church heavily to fund his military campaigns. He refused to let church councils meet without his permission. He generally treated the church as subordinate to royal authority, and the church did not appreciate this one bit. When these chroniclers sat down to write about William, they were writing about a king they considered an enemy of the church, and they used every tool in their rhetorical arsenal to paint him as a terrible king and a worse Christian. The accusations about his court being full of sodomites have to be read in that context. We don't have neutral sources about William Rufus. We don't have sources written by people who liked him. What we have are hostile accounts written by people who wanted to convince readers that William was a tyrant and a sinner who deserved his suspicious death in the forest. The stuff about long hair and fancy clothes and effeminate courtiers might be true. Courts did have fashion trends that went in and out of style, and what one generation thought was stylish might strike the next generation as excessive or inappropriate. But the claims about widespread sodomy and unnatural practices? Those might also be true, or they might be exaggerations or even fabrications meant to make William look as bad as possible. What's interesting is that accusations about effeminacy and unnaturalness became a package deal in these chronicles. Long hair wasn't just a fashion choice, it was evidence of men becoming womanly, which was connected to sexual unnaturalness, which was connected to the general moral decay of the realm. The chroniclers were constructing a whole world view where deviations from proper masculine appearance indicated deeper spiritual and sexual corruption. It's not enough that the courtiers might have been having inappropriate relationships. They also had to be dressed wrong, styled wrong, and generally performing gender incorrectly according to the chroniclers' standards. This tells us something about how medieval people connected different concepts together. Effeminacy, sodomy, pride, and tyranny all got bundled together as evidence of a king who had rejected proper Christian order. A good king was masculine in the right ways, martial, stern, properly dressed, sexually restrained with women, and not interested in men at all. A bad king let his court become a place of confusion where men acted like women, where fashion became excessive, where the natural order broke down. Whether any specific sexual acts occurred was almost beside the point. The chroniclers were making an argument about the kind of king William was, and accusations of unnaturalness were part of that rhetorical strategy. Did William Rufus actually have relationships with men? We genuinely can't know. The sources are too hostile and too ideologically motivated to take at face value. What we can say is that his court apparently did have a reputation for stylistic excess, and possibly for sexual behaviour that offended clerical sensibilities, that this reputation was preserved and amplified by chroniclers who already hated him for other reasons, and that accusations of unnaturalness were deployed as part of a broader campaign to paint his reign as disastrous. The chroniclers wanted readers to see William's death in that hunting accident as divine judgment, as God removing a wicked king. The accusations about his court's moral state were part of building that narrative. William never married and never had legitimate children, which also attracted comment from chroniclers. They noted this as further evidence of his unnaturalness, as a rejection of the proper Christian duty to marry and produce heirs. Of course, plenty of medieval kings had mistresses and illegitimate children even when they were married, and this was generally seen as normal and not particularly shameful, as long as they also did their duty with their wives. But William had neither wife nor acknowledged mistresses nor bastards, which struck chroniclers as strange. In their minds, a normal man, even a sinful one, would have been showing interest in women somewhere along the line. William's apparent complete lack of interest in women of any kind was noted as unusual, and incorporated into the broader picture of a king whose desires ran in unnatural directions. The thing is, we don't actually know why William never married. Maybe he was gay. Maybe he was asexual. Maybe he was so focused on military campaigns and political conflicts that he never got around to it. Maybe he had relationships that weren't documented. Maybe he just didn't want to marry and figured being king meant he could make his own choices about it. Medieval people didn't have the language or concepts to distinguish between these possibilities, so they interpreted his unmarried state through their own frameworks of understanding, which led to conclusions about unnaturalness. What William Rufus's story shows us is how accusations of unnaturalness could be deployed as part of a broader political and ideological attack. The clerical chroniclers who wrote about him were constructing a narrative of a bad king, and they threw everything into that narrative: tyranny, greed, sacrilege, pride, and sexual unnaturalness. All of these things together proved that William was a wicked king who met a deserved end. Whether each specific accusation was true mattered less than the overall portrait they were painting. This is propaganda, basically, and we have to read it as such. Now let's talk about King John, because his case is different again and shows yet another way accusations of unnaturalness could work in medieval politics. John is already famous for being a terrible king. He's the bad guy in the Robin Hood legends. He lost most of England's territories in France. He got into such a massive conflict with the Pope that England was placed under interdict, and he was eventually forced by his barons to sign the Magna Carta limiting royal power. The man had a genuine talent for making enemies. But among all his documented failings, there's also a persistent rumour that circulated in his own time and afterward about his sexual behaviour, specifically that he had an inappropriate interest in young men. The main source for this is Roger of Wendover, a chronicler writing a couple decades after John's death. Roger claimed that John's barons rebelled against him partly because the king had been defiling their daughters and sisters and kinswomen, but also because he had made advances toward their sons. The language Roger uses is actually quite explicit. He says John pursued young men for wicked acts, and that this was part of why the nobility turned against him. Other chronicles hint at similar accusations but are less specific, referring to John's unnaturalness and perverse desires, without spelling out exactly what they meant. Now the thing about John is that he was definitely interested in women, possibly too interested in ways that created political problems. He had a reputation for seducing or coercing noblemen's wives and daughters, which was both morally wrong and politically stupid because it turned powerful men into his enemies. There are documented cases of John taking women from their husbands or fathers, and this wasn't subtle. Everyone knew about it. It created genuine grievances among the nobility that contributed to their eventual rebellion against him. So the accusations about women are well-founded and documented from multiple sources. The accusations about young men are less clear. They come primarily from that one chronicle written by someone who had plenty of other reasons to hate John. They're not corroborated in detail by other contemporary sources, though other sources do use language about John's unnatural lusts that could mean various things. This is where it gets complicated, because we have to figure out whether Roger of Wendover was accurately reporting things that people at court knew about, or whether he was taking John's documented predatory behaviour toward women and adding accusations about men to make it sound even worse, or whether these were rumours that circulated at court that may or may not have been true. What makes John's case interesting is that the accusations about unnaturalness weren't the main thing anyone focused on. His real problems were political: the military failures, the conflicts with the church and the barons, the loss of territories, the heavy taxation. The sexual accusations, both about women and about men, were part of a broader catalogue of failures and sins. They served to illustrate that John was a bad king who let his personal desires override his political judgment and moral duty. Whether he actually made advances toward young men, or whether this was just a rumour that got included in the list of his failures, it functioned rhetorically as evidence of his general wickedness. This is important because it shows how accusations of unnaturalness worked in medieval political discourse. They were rarely the main accusation. They were part of a package of charges meant to demonstrate that a king was unfit to rule. A king who was militarily successful, politically stable, and kept his nobility happy could get away with a lot of personal behaviour that might be questionable. But a king who was failing politically? Suddenly every rumour, every questionable relationship, every bit of unusual behaviour got collected and weaponised against him. The accusations of unnaturalness were most devastating when they were added to other, more concrete political failures. With John, the barons who eventually forced him to sign the Magna Carta had plenty of legitimate grievances: his arbitrary use of royal power, his financial demands, his military failures, his conflicts with the church. The sexual accusations were just more evidence piled onto an already substantial case that John was a tyrant. Whether those specific accusations were true or exaggerated or invented, they served the purpose of painting John as a king who violated every norm: political, legal, moral, and sexual. The unnaturalness became one item in a long list proving that John needed to be constrained or removed. What we see across all these cases, Richard III, William Rufus, and King John, is that accusations of unnaturalness followed a pattern. They were most likely to appear or to be emphasised in sources when a king was politically vulnerable or after he'd lost power. They were deployed as part of broader attacks on a king's fitness to rule. They were bundled together with other accusations about tyranny, greed, pride, and moral failing. And they were particularly effective because they implied that the king had violated not just human law, but divine law, not just political norms, but natural order itself. The term unnatural carried such weight because it invoked the entire medieval Christian worldview about creation, order, and sin. Nature was how God had ordered the world. Natural law was God's law written into creation itself. To act unnaturally was to rebel against God's design, to choose disorder over order, chaos over creation. It was a profound accusation, suggesting not just moral failing, but spiritual rebellion. When chroniclers called a king's behaviour unnatural, they were saying that king had placed himself outside the divine order, that his rule was illegitimate because it violated fundamental cosmic principles. But, and this is crucial, the term got used selectively. Not every king who had male favourites got called unnatural. Not every king who had questionable relationships got accused of violating natural law. The accusation appeared when it was politically useful, when it served someone's purpose to paint a king in the worst possible light. This doesn't mean the accusations were always false, but it does mean we can't take them at face value. We have to ask, who's making this accusation, when are they making it, what do they gain from making it, and what other evidence exists? Sometimes the accusations seem to have reflected genuine court knowledge about a king's relationships. Edward II's relationships were so public and so politically significant that everyone knew about them, and the language chroniclers used seems to reflect actual knowledge about what was happening. Sometimes the accusations seem more like propaganda, like the clerical chroniclers' attacks on William Rufus that served their broader agenda of portraying him as an enemy of the church. Sometimes we genuinely can't tell what was real observation and what was political weapon, like with the accusations about King John. What's particularly interesting is how accusations of effeminacy and unnaturalness got connected. Medieval masculinity was supposed to look a certain way: martial, stern, properly dressed, sexually directed toward women for the purpose of producing heirs. When a king or his court deviated from this model, it could be read as evidence of deeper corruption. Long hair, fancy clothes, and refined manners could be seen as men becoming womanly, which was connected to sexual unnaturalness because both were seen as violations of proper gender order. The chroniclers weren't always making clear distinctions between gender performance and sexual behaviour. To them, it was all connected as part of rejecting proper masculine order. This is why William Rufus's court got described in terms of both clothing choices and sexual behaviour. The chroniclers saw these as related manifestations of the same problem: men who were rejecting proper masculinity. Whether they were actually engaged in sodomy or just wearing shoes the chroniclers found ridiculous, it all got bundled together as evidence of unnaturalness. The fashion choices became legible as signs of sexual deviance, and the sexual deviance was made worse by the gender performance failures. It was a complete package of wrongness. For Richard II, his attachment to Robert de Vere was seen as unnatural partly because it was excessive, beyond measure, but also because it made Richard seem weak and dependent in ways that violated proper kingly masculinity. A king was supposed to be strong, independent, guided by counsel from his nobility, but ultimately making his own decisions. Richard's apparent inability to function without de Vere's presence suggested a kind of emotional dependency that struck contemporary observers as unmanly. The fact that the relationship might have been sexual just made it worse. Even if it wasn't sexual, the emotional dependency itself was problematic because it violated gender norms about how men, especially kings, were supposed to behave. This all tells us that medieval accusations of unnaturalness were complex. They were about sexual behaviour, but also about gender performance, political loyalty, emotional attachment, and power dynamics. They were deployed strategically by people who had reasons to attack particular kings. They followed patterns, appearing more frequently and explicitly when kings were vulnerable. And they were profoundly effective because they tapped into deep cultural anxieties about order, nature, and divine law. When we try to figure out what actually happened in these cases, we have to sort through multiple layers. There's the behaviour itself, whatever it was. There's how it was perceived and described by contemporaries who saw it at court. There's how it was written down by chroniclers who had their own agendas. There's how those chronicles were copied and sometimes edited by later scribes. There's how the stories were told and retold in later centuries, often with additions and exaggerations. And there's how modern historians have interpreted all of this, bringing their own assumptions and frameworks to the evidence. The reality is that we often can't get back to the original behaviour with certainty. What we can do is understand how accusations of unnaturalness functioned in medieval political discourse, how they were deployed and why they were effective. We can see the patterns in who got accused and when. We can understand what these accusations meant in their original context and how that context was different from our own. And we can be appropriately skeptical about sources that had obvious political or ideological reasons to portray kings in the worst possible light. What stays consistent across all these cases is that accusations of unnaturalness were powerful weapons. They could damage a king's reputation, provide justification for rebellion or deposition, and shape how a reign was remembered by posterity. They were particularly effective because they combined moral judgment, theological condemnation, and political critique in one package. A king who was unnatural was a bad king, a sinful king, and a king who violated divine order. That's a hard accusation to defend against, which is exactly why it got deployed so often against kings who had made powerful enemies. The medieval period shows us how intimate relationships and personal behaviour could become intensely political. Kings couldn't have purely private lives. Everything they did was observed, discussed, interpreted, and judged by people who had stakes in how royal power was exercised. A king's choice of favourites, his emotional attachments, his sexual behaviour, even his fashion choices could become matters of state importance. And when those behaviours could be characterised as unnatural, they became weapons that could be used to challenge royal authority itself. The accusation of unnaturalness wasn't just about personal morality. It was about whether a king deserved to rule, whether he was fit for the office, whether he was maintaining the proper order that kingship was supposed to represent. That's why the accusations mattered so much and why they've echoed through history, shaping how we remember these kings centuries later. If the medieval period gave us kings whose relationships were described in careful code, The Stuart dynasty gave us something rather different, kings who wrote everything down. Like everything. Letters, poetry, declarations of affection that would make a modern romance novelist blush, all preserved for posterity because apparently the Stuarts never met an emotion they didn't want to document in writing. This is both a blessing and a curse for historians. A blessing because we have actual primary sources in the king's own words describing their feelings. A curse because we have to read love letters written by 17th century monarchs, and let me tell you, they did not hold back. There's something deeply strange about reading a king address another man as my sweet child and wife in an official letter. But that's where we're headed, so buckle up. The Stuarts also give us something else interesting. A pattern. This wasn't just one king with one favourite. This was a dynasty where intense male favourites became a recurring feature across generations, almost like a family tradition that nobody wanted to acknowledge, but everybody participated in anyway. It's like each Stuart king looked at his predecessor's relationship drama, thought, I would definitely handle that better, and then proceeded to do exactly the same thing with slightly different people. If there's anything the Stuart dynasty proves, it's that humans are remarkably bad at learning from family history when it comes to matters of the heart. Let's start with James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England when he inherited the English throne in 1603, thereby uniting the crowns and also bringing his relationship patterns to a whole new court that was not prepared for the level of favouritism they were about to witness. James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, which already gave him some interesting genetic material to work with in terms of dramatic life choices. His early life was turbulent, his mother was forced to abdicate when he was a baby, he was raised by regents, and he witnessed some truly spectacular court intrigue before he even hit puberty. So perhaps it's not surprising that when he finally had power of his own, he used it to surround himself with people he could trust and feel emotionally close to, consequences be damned. The first significant favourite was Esme Stuart, a French cousin who arrived at the Scottish court when James was 13 years old. James became immediately and intensely attached to Esme, which, considering he'd just met him and James was a teenager, probably tells us something about how starved for affection the young king was. He showered Esme with titles, made him Duke of Lennox, and generally behaved like a teenager with his first serious crush, which might be exactly what it was. The Scottish Protestant nobles looked at this Catholic Frenchman who had suddenly acquired enormous influence over their young king and decided this was a problem. They forced Esme into exile in 1582 and James never saw him again. Esme died a year later and by all accounts James was devastated. This set a pattern that would repeat throughout James's life: intense attachment to a favourite, elevation of that favourite to positions of power and wealth, opposition from nobles who resented the favouritism, an eventual separation that left James grief-stricken. You'd think after the first time this would have taught him something about maybe distributing his affections more strategically. You would be wrong. James just kept doing it, over and over, with slightly different men and slightly different outcomes, but the same basic emotional pattern playing out each time. After Esme, there were other favourites during James's time as King of Scotland, but the really significant relationships came after he became King of England. Enter Robert Carr, a young Scottish gentleman who literally fell off a horse in front of the king during a jousting tournament, and somehow parlayed this into becoming the most powerful man in England besides James himself. This is not how career advancement usually works, but apparently James liked what he saw, both the falling and whatever came after. Carr was in his early 20s, handsome, and had that combination of youth and inexperience that made him seem non-threatening to a king who wanted companions rather than rivals. James promoted Carr rapidly, making him a gentleman of the bedchamber, then Viscount Rochester, then Earl of Somerset. More importantly, James gave him access, influence, and affection that was visible to the entire court. We know about the nature of their relationship because James wrote letters to Carr that have survived, and they are something else. James addressed Carr as "my sweet child," and signed himself "your dear dad and husband." Which, okay, there's a lot to unpack in that particular choice of self-description, but the point is that James was not subtle about his attachment. He called Carr "my sweet child and wife" in another letter, combining familial and marital language in ways that suggest either James had some very confused ideas about relationships, or he was deliberately using multiple frameworks of intimacy to express the depth of his feeling. The letters are remarkable documents because they show us James's emotional state without any filter. He wrote things like, "I desire only to live in this world for your sake," and promised Carr that he would rather die than be separated from him. This is not the language of political alliance or casual friendship. This is someone completely emotionally dependent on another person, and that person was a man young enough to be his son, whom he'd promoted from minor gentleman to major political power. The English court watched all this happening and had opinions, most of which boiled down to this again, because they'd heard about how James operated in Scotland and had hoped maybe English kingship would be different. It was not different. Carr's influence over James was complete enough that he became involved in policy decisions, patronage appointments, and basically every aspect of royal governance. This might have been fine if Carr had been politically brilliant, but he was mainly just young and not particularly well prepared for the responsibilities James thrust upon him. He also got involved in a massive scandal involving the poisoning of Sir Thomas Overbury, who had opposed Carr's marriage plans, and the whole thing became such a mess that even James's affection couldn't completely protect him. Carr was tried and convicted of being an accessory to murder, though James later pardoned him. But by that point, James had already moved on to a new favourite who would become even more significant than Carr ever was. That favourite was George Villiers, and if you thought James's relationship with Carr was intense, Villiers took it to another level entirely. Villiers entered royal service in 1614 as a cupbearer, a decorative position at court that mainly involved looking attractive while pouring drinks, which Villiers was apparently very good at. James noticed him immediately, which was the point of putting handsome young men in positions where the king would see them regularly. Court factions who were opposed to Carr's influence deliberately promoted Villiers as a potential rival favourite, thinking they could use him to displace Carr and then control the new favourite more effectively. This plan worked in terms of displacing Carr, but spectacularly backfired in terms of controlling Villiers, who turned out to have political ambitions and skills that far exceeded what anyone expected. James fell for Villiers completely. He created him Earl, then Marquess, then Duke of Buckingham, making him the first non-royal duke in England in a century. More significantly, he gave Villiers a level of power and access that exceeded anything Carr had enjoyed. Villiers became the gateway to the king. Anyone who wanted anything from James had to go through Buckingham. He controlled patronage, influenced policy, and essentially functioned as a parallel power centre to the king himself. And James was fine with this, more than fine, because he was absolutely besotted with Villiers. The letters James wrote to Villiers are even more explicit than the ones to Carr, if you can imagine. James called Villiers Steenie, a nickname derived from St. Stephen, because James thought Villiers' face resembled the face of St. Stephen in paintings. You know, totally normal things to say to your political advisor. He wrote letters addressing Villiers as my sweet child and wife again, because apparently that was James's favourite term of endearment regardless of which favourite he was writing to. He declared that he loved Villiers more than anyone else in the world, including his own children. He wrote that Christ had John and he had his George. That last one is particularly notable because James was directly comparing his relationship with Villiers to Christ's relationship with the beloved disciple, which is either deeply blasphemous or deeply revealing, depending on your perspective. James also gave a speech to his Privy Council in 1617 defending his relationship with Villiers, which is honestly one of the most remarkable documents in English royal history. He told his councillors, "I, James, am neither a god nor an angel, but a man like any other. Therefore I act like a man and confess to loving those dear to me more than other men. You may be sure that I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else, and more than you who are here assembled. I wish to speak in my own behalf and not to have it thought to be a defect, for Jesus Christ did the same, and therefore I cannot be blamed. Christ had John, and I have George, and let that sink in for a moment." The king stood up in front of his government officials and delivered a speech defending his right to love another man more than anyone else, explicitly comparing that relationship to Christ and John, and essentially daring anyone to criticize him for it. This is not a king trying to hide his affections. This is a king publicly declaring them and challenging anyone to say there was anything wrong with them. The speech acknowledges that people were talking about his relationship with Villiers, and James's response was not to deny the relationship's significance, but to defend it by invoking biblical precedent and royal prerogative. Now, were James's relationships with Carr and Villiers sexual? The letters certainly use intimate language, but they also use familial language, and the mixing of metaphors makes interpretation complicated. Some historians have argued that James was gay, and that these were clearly romantic and sexual relationships. Others have argued that James was using the language of intense friendship that was available to him, and that we shouldn't read sexual content into letters that might just be expressing deep platonic affection. Still others have pointed out that the distinction between romantic friendship and sexual relationship might not have been as clear in the 17th century as we want it to be. and that asking whether they had sex might be missing the point about what these relationships meant to James. What we can say is that James's emotional life was centered on these male favourites, that he gave them power and wealth and access that created political problems, that he wrote them letters expressing love and devotion in terms that went beyond conventional friendship, and that he publicly defended these relationships against criticism. Whether specific sexual acts occurred is something we can't definitively determine from the surviving evidence, but the emotional and political significance of the relationships is undeniable. James also had a wife, Anne of Denmark, and children with her, so he was clearly capable of heterosexual relationships. But by all accounts, his marriage was distant and became more so over time. Anne and James lived separately for much of their marriage, corresponded rarely, and don't seem to have been emotionally close after the early years. This doesn't prove anything about James's sexuality. Plenty of people have distant arranged marriages, and that tells us nothing about their orientations. But it does tell us that the emotional centre of James's life was not his wife and family. It was his male favourites, particularly Villiers in the later years of his reign. The political consequences of James's favouritism were significant. The English nobility resented Villiers' power and the way royal patronage was concentrated in his hands. There were multiple attempts to break Villiers' influence, all of which failed because James refused to give him up. This pattern of a favourite accumulating power and creating resentment should sound familiar by now. It's basically what happened with every king we've discussed. The difference with James is that he managed to die of natural causes while still king, and while Villiers still had power, which meant the pattern didn't end with the favourite's disgrace and execution. Instead, it continued into the next reign. Because here's where the Stuart pattern gets really interesting. When James died in 1625, his son Charles I inherited the throne and also inherited George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. And Charles was just as attached to Buckingham as his father had been, though the nature of the attachment seems to have been different. Charles and Buckingham had grown up together. Buckingham had been a presence at court since Charles was a teenager, and they developed their own close friendship independent of James's relationship with Buckingham. When Charles became king, instead of distancing himself from his father's favourite, he kept Buckingham in power and continued to rely on him for everything. The relationship between Charles and Buckingham has been debated by historians because it doesn't fit quite the same pattern as James's relationships. There's no surviving letters from Charles to Buckingham using the kind of intimate language James employed. The relationship seems to have been more about deep friendship and political partnership than romantic attachment, though some historians have argued there was more to it than that. What's undeniable is that Charles was completely dependent on Buckingham politically and emotionally. He trusted Buckingham with military commands, diplomatic missions, and domestic policy. He defended Buckingham against Parliament's attempts to impeach him. And when Buckingham was assassinated in 1628, Charles was devastated and went into deep mourning. The pattern in the Stuart family is remarkable. Here's James with his series of male favourites to whom he was emotionally dependent, writing them letters full of intimate language and giving them political power. And here's Charles, his son, who witnessed all of this growing up and then proceeded to form his own intense attachment to the same man who had been his father's favourite. It's like they passed Buckingham down as a family heirloom, and both of them structured their emotional and political lives around him. This is not normal royal behaviour, even for this period. The concentration of affection and power in single male figures across 2 generations suggests something distinctive about the Stuart family's emotional patterns. But wait, there's more, because we need to talk about James's father, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and the complicated triangle involving him, Mary Queen of Scots, and David Rizzio. This takes us back a generation before James, but it's relevant because it might tell us something about the family dynamics that James inherited. Darnley married Mary in 1565, and by all accounts the marriage went bad quickly. Darnley was young, handsome, and spectacularly unsuited for any kind of political responsibility. Mary initially found him attractive, but rapidly realised she'd made a terrible mistake. Enter David Rizzio, Mary's Italian secretary, who became very close to the Queen. He was her private secretary, her confidant, and by many accounts, her friend in a court where she had few people she could trust. Rizzio was also, according to hostile sources, effeminate in manner and appearance, which immediately made him subject to rumours and accusations. The relationship between Mary and Rizzio was close enough that people started gossiping that they were lovers, which may or may not have been true but certainly served the purposes of people who wanted to undermine Mary's authority. Darnley became convinced that Mary and Rizzio were having an affair, possibly because he was told this by nobles who wanted to manipulate him, possibly because he'd observed their closeness and jumped to conclusions, possibly because it was true. But here's where it gets strange. Some contemporary sources suggest that Darnley himself had been close to Rizzio, that they'd been friends, or possibly more than friends, before Darnley became jealous of Rizzio's closeness to Mary. The exact nature of the relationships is murky. We have rumours, gossip, and politically motivated accusations, but not a lot of clear evidence about what actually happened. What we do know is that in 1566, a group of nobles, including Darnley, broke into Mary's private chambers and murdered Rizzio in front of her while she was 6 months pregnant with the future James I. They stabbed him 56 times, which is excessive even by the standards of 16th century political murder. The official justification was that Rizzio had too much influence over the Queen and needed to be removed, but the violence suggests something more personal was going on. Some sources claim Darnley suspected Rizzio of being the father of Mary's child, though the timing doesn't really support this. Others suggest the murder was politically motivated with jealousy as a convenient excuse. The triangle between Mary, Darnley and Rizzio has been interpreted multiple ways. The traditional narrative is that Mary and Rizzio were lovers, Darnley found out, and jealousy motivated the murder. But some historians have suggested that the relationships were more complicated, that Darnley might have been jealous of Mary's closeness to Rizzio because he himself had feelings for Rizzio, or that the murder was driven by Darnley's rage at being excluded from the intimate circle that Mary and Rizzio shared, regardless of whether that circle was sexual or just political and personal. What makes this relevant to James is that he grew up knowing this story. His father murdered his mother's secretary in front of her while she was pregnant with him. His father was then himself murdered a year later under mysterious circumstances that probably involved his mother's complicity. James inherited a legacy of intimate relationships turning violent, of favourites causing political chaos, of the line between personal affection and political alliance being dangerously blurred. And then he proceeded to recreate similar patterns in his own life, forming intense attachments to male favourites that created political problems and court scandal. It's tempting to do amateur psychology here and suggest that James's attachment to male favourites was related to his traumatic family history, his absent mother, his murdered father, his unstable childhood. Maybe growing up in that environment made him crave emotional bonds that felt safe and under his control. Maybe the intensity of his attachments to Esme Stewart, Robert Carr and George Villiers was about trying to create the family intimacy he'd never had as a child. Or maybe he was just gay and living in a time when being a king gave him more freedom to pursue the relationships he wanted than most people had. Or maybe both things were true simultaneously. What we can observe is that the Stuart dynasty had a pattern. James had intense, politically significant relationships with male favourites that he defended publicly and expressed in intimate language. His son Charles continued the pattern with the same favourite James had relied on. James's father had been part of a complicated triangle involving jealousy and murder that left questions about the nature of the relationships involved. This is not one isolated incident. This is a family pattern across generations, which suggests either something genetic, something cultural within the family, or something about the particular pressures and opportunities of Stuart kingship that led to these relationship patterns developing. The language James used in his letters is worth pausing over, because it tells us something about how he understood these relationships. He repeatedly used both familial and marital language, sweet child and wife, dear dad and husband. He's combining father-son language with husband-wife language, creating this hybrid relationship vocabulary that doesn't map onto any single conventional relationship type. This could be because James was expressing same-sex romantic feelings using the only intimate relationship language available to him, which was heterosexual and familial. It could be because the relationships themselves were complicated and combined different kinds of intimacy. Paternal affection, romantic love, sexual desire, deep friendship, all mixed together in ways that defy simple categorization. The fact that James compared his relationship with Villiers to Christ and John is also significant. This was invoking the beloved disciple tradition, which had a long history in Christian thought and had been used to describe and justify intense same-sex friendships for centuries. But James wasn't just quietly invoking that tradition in private letters. He was doing it in a public speech to his government, explicitly defending his right to love another man in those terms. This suggests that James understood his society had a framework for accepting intense male friendship, and he was claiming that framework for his relationship with Villiers, even as the relationship went beyond what most people would consider normal friendship. The political elite's response to James's favourites is instructive. They didn't like the favouritism, they resented the concentration of power in Villiers' hands, and they absolutely gossiped about the king's emotional dependency. But they couldn't effectively challenge it because James had the political power to defend his favourites, and because he was willing to use that power to do so. The Privy Council speech, where James defended his love for Buckingham, essentially told the political elite to accept it or face the consequences. And they accepted it, not because they were okay with it, but because crossing the king over his personal attachments was more trouble than it was worth. This tells us something important about how same-sex relationships could function at the highest levels of power. As long as a king was effective enough at his job and powerful enough to enforce his will, he could get away with relationships that would have been impossible for anyone else. James's kingship gave him a degree of freedom that ordinary people didn't have. He could form relationships with men, write them intimate letters, give them political power, and defend those relationships publicly. And while people might gossip and complain, they couldn't actually stop him. The same patterns that got medieval kings deposed or murdered, excessive favouritism, emotional dependency on male companions, neglect of the nobility's concerns, James managed to sustain throughout his reign because he was just competent enough and powerful enough to get away with it. The contrast with medieval kings like Edward VI or Richard VI is instructive. Those kings fell partly because they let their emotional attachments override their political judgment to the point where they lost the support they needed to maintain power. James walked a finer line. He absolutely prioritised his favourites and gave them enormous power, but he never completely alienated the nobility to the point of rebellion, and he maintained enough political stability that his favouritism remained a source of grumbling rather than active resistance. This was partly luck, partly skill, and partly the fact that Stuart England was structured differently from medieval England in ways that gave James more secure power. Charles III's relationship with Buckingham continued this pattern, but also shows its limits. Unlike James, Charles faced a parliament that was increasingly willing to challenge royal authority. When Parliament tried to impeach Buckingham, Charles dissolved Parliament rather than abandon his favourite. This contributed to the constitutional crisis that eventually led to the English Civil War. The Stuart pattern of intense male favourites wasn't just personally significant. It had political consequences that contributed to the dynasty's eventual troubles. Charles's inability to separate his personal attachment to Buckingham from his political judgment was one of many factors that undermined his relationship with Parliament. After Buckingham's assassination, Charles never formed another comparable attachment. He became closer to his wife, Henrietta Maria, whom he'd married in 1625 but had initially had a distant relationship with, partly because Buckingham was still around taking up all of Charles's emotional energy. Without Buckingham, Charles and Henrietta Maria developed what seems to have been a genuine affectionate partnership. This suggests that Charles's attachment to Buckingham wasn't about a fixed sexual orientation, so much as it was about that specific relationship with that specific person, which had formed in his youth and shaped his emotional life. The Stuart dynasty shows us how royal same-sex relationships evolved from the medieval period into the early modern era. The language became more explicit. We have actual love letters in the king's own words rather than just chronicles describing behaviour. The relationships became more documentable because literacy and record-keeping had improved. But the basic political dynamics remained similar. Favourites accumulated power, nobility resented it, and kings had to balance their personal attachments against political necessity. What changed was that kings like James felt more able to defend these relationships publicly, to invoke religious and philosophical frameworks that legitimised intense male friendship, and to dare their critics to challenge them directly. The Stuart pattern also shows us that these relationships weren't anomalies or isolated incidents. They were recurring features across generations of the same family, which suggests something about how patterns of attachment and relationship formation can run in families even across very different time periods and contexts. Whether this was about genetics, family culture, learned behaviour, or the specific pressures of Stuart kingship, the pattern is undeniable. The Stuarts had a thing for male favourites, and they kept doing it even when it created political problems, because apparently emotional attachment is more powerful than political calculation, even for kings. Looking at the Stuarts as a dynasty rather than as individual kings reveals something important about how personal relationships and political power interacted in early modern monarchy. These weren't just individual quirks of personality. They were family patterns, transmitted across generations, shaped by family history and trauma, and playing out in ways that had significant political consequences. James's relationships with his favourites can't be understood without knowing about his father's complicated triangle with Mary and Rizzio. Charles's relationship with Buckingham can't be understood without knowing about his father's relationship with the same man. The family dynamics, the emotional patterns, and the political consequences all build on each other across generations. This is also why the Stuart pattern matters for understanding the broader history of same-sex relationships in British royalty. This wasn't medieval ambiguity or careful coding. This was a king writing "I love you more than anyone else" in actual letters that were preserved and archived. This was a king giving a speech defending his right to love another man by comparing himself to Christ. This was documentation that's hard to explain away or reinterpret, because the language is right there in the historical record, written by the kings themselves. The Stuarts took what had been whispered about and written in code during the medieval period and documented it explicitly in ways that future historians couldn't ignore or easily dismiss. The dynasty of duality is an appropriate description because the Stuarts existed in this space between public and private, between acknowledged and unspoken, between acceptable and scandalous. They had wives and legitimate heirs, maintaining the appearance of conventional monarchy. But they also had their male favourites, whom they loved with an intensity that shaped policy and politics. They operated in both worlds simultaneously, never fully resolving the tension between them, and that unresolved tension is part of what makes their stories so fascinating and so significant for understanding how same-sex relationships functioned at the highest levels of power in early modern Europe. Now we're moving from the raw emotional intensity of the Stuarts into territory where things get simultaneously more subtle and more theatrical, if you can imagine such a combination. Because the late 17th and 18th centuries gave us something different. Kings and princes who understood that presentation mattered, that style was substance, and that who you surrounded yourself with and how you presented that relationship was a carefully calculated performance. Not that earlier periods didn't involve performance. Medieval and Stuart courts were absolutely theatrical, but now the performance became more refined, more coded, and more deliberately tied to aesthetics and fashion. This is the era when royal favourites stopped being just about emotional attachment or political influence and became about taste, refinement, and what we might call lifestyle choices, though that phrase doesn't quite capture the complexity of what was happening. Let's start with William III, because his story bridges multiple worlds in fascinating ways. He was Dutch, he became King of England through marriage to his cousin Mary II, and he brought with him a Dutch court culture that was different from what the English were used to. William came from the sophisticated urban culture of the Netherlands, where there were different social norms and different ways of understanding relationships between men. He also came with Hans Willem Bentinck, who would become one of the most powerful and controversial figures in English politics during William's reign, not because of his political abilities, though he had those, but because of his relationship with the king. Bentinck had been William's page when they were both young, and over the years he became William's closest companion, confidant, and eventually one of his most trusted advisors. When William came to England as king in 1689, he brought Bentinck with him and immediately elevated him to the English peerage, making him Earl of Portland. This was not unusual for a new king. Bringing your trusted people and rewarding them with titles was standard practice. What made it notable was the level of intimacy between William and Bentinck that was visible to everyone at court, and the fact that William seemed completely indifferent to English complaints about giving so much power to a foreigner. The English court watched William and Bentinck and had thoughts. They noticed that Bentinck had access to the king at all hours. They noticed that William preferred Bentinck's company to almost anyone else's. They noticed that Bentinck's apartments were connected to the king's by a private staircase, which allowed for comings and goings without having to pass through public spaces where people might observe and comment. Not that this stopped people from observing and commenting anyway. Court gossip is like water, it finds a way through every crack. The arrangement became such common knowledge that satirists and pamphleteers had a field day with it, producing works that made not very subtle jokes about the nature of the relationship. One of the most famous satirical pieces from this period referred to William's male wives and suggested that he preferred the company of his Dutch friends to his actual wife, Queen Mary. This was politically motivated. William had enemies who wanted to undermine him, and attacking his personal relationships was a convenient way to do that. But the attacks gained traction because they built on observations about behaviour that the entire court could see. The intimacy between William and Bentinck was real and visible, and satire works best when it exaggerates something that's actually there rather than inventing it from nothing. The relationship between William and Bentinck was complicated by the fact that William also formed a close attachment to another, younger favourite, Arnold Just van Keppel, who became Earl of Albemarle. Keppel was in his early 20s when he entered William's service, handsome, charming, and apparently exactly what William was looking for in addition to, or possibly instead of, Bentinck. William began showing Keppel the kind of favour he'd previously reserved for Bentinck, and Bentinck was, unsurprisingly, not thrilled about this development. Court observers noted tension between the two favourites as they competed for William's attention and favour, which must have been quite the spectacle. Two grown men, both earls, both with significant political power, essentially fighting over who got to sit closest to the king. The situation became enough of a problem that William apparently felt the need to mediate between his two favourites, trying to maintain relationships with both of them while preventing them from undermining each other politically. This is not a position any king should want to be in, having to manage the rivalry between your current favourite and your former favourite because you're emotionally attached to both of them and can't seem to just pick one. It's almost endearing in its messiness in a way. Here's the King of England dealing with complex international politics and religious tensions and parliamentary conflicts, and also having to soothe the hurt feelings of men who feel they're not getting enough of his attention. Priorities. What makes William's case interesting is that unlike the Stuarts, we don't have passionate love letters in his own hand declaring his feelings. William was more reserved, more Dutch, and more careful about what he put in writing. What we have instead is the observable behaviour, the access he granted his favourites, the wealth and titles he showered on them, the architectural arrangements that facilitated private meetings, and the court gossip and satire that interpreted all of this. We're reading the relationship through what people at the time saw and said about it, which is a different kind of evidence than letters but still tells us something significant. The satirical attacks on William often connected his supposed relationships with men to his failures as a husband. Mary thus died in 1694, and by several accounts William was genuinely grief-stricken. But she had been the one with the hereditary claim to the English throne. William was king through her, not in his own right, which made his position somewhat awkward after her death. The fact that their marriage had been distant, that they had no children, and that William seemed to prefer the company of Bentinck and later Keppel to his wife's company, became fodder for political attacks. His enemies painted him as an unnatural husband who neglected his wife for his male favourites, which was meant to undermine his legitimacy as king. What's notable about the William III situation is how openly discussed it was compared to earlier periods. Yes, there had been gossip and satire about earlier kings and their favourites, but not quite to this extent or in this form. The late 17th century saw the rise of print culture, newspapers, pamphlets, and satirical prints that circulated widely and made royal private life increasingly public. William's relationships became a matter of public commentary in ways that would have been harder to achieve in earlier periods. This meant that the court's knowledge about the king's favourites wasn't confined to the court anymore. It was being discussed, debated, and satirised in coffeehouses and taverns across London. The Dutch connection is also significant because it brought different cultural attitudes about same-sex relationships into contact with English culture. The Netherlands had its own culture of male friendship and intimacy that wasn't identical to English traditions, and William brought those cultural assumptions with him. Some of the English discomfort with William's relationships might have been about cultural differences as much as about the relationships themselves. The Dutch king and his Dutch friends who do things differently than proper Englishmen. Xenophobia and homophobia got tangled together in ways that made it hard to separate one from the other. Now let's jump forward to the Georgian period and talk about George IV, because if William III's relationships were about intimacy and access, George IV's most famous relationship was about style. Specifically, his relationship with Beau Brummel, who was not a sexual favourite. There's no evidence the relationship was romantic or physical, but who occupied a similar position in terms of influence and intimacy, just expressed through the language of fashion rather than the language of political favour or emotional attachment. Beau Brummel, whose actual name was George Bryan Brummel, was the arbiter of fashion in Regency England. He was not nobility. His grandfather had been a valet, though his father had done well enough to give Beau a gentleman's education. What Brummel had was impeccable taste, a talent for social performance, and the ability to make other people feel desperately unfashionable just by existing in their vicinity. He revolutionised men's fashion by rejecting the elaborate, colourful styles of the 18th century in favour of what we'd recognise as the modern suit, well-tailored, understated, elegant. His philosophy was that clothes should be perfectly fitted and immaculately clean but otherwise understated, letting the man's bearing and personality do the work rather than relying on excessive decoration. George IV, who was Prince of Wales during most of Brummell's influence, became friends with Brummell in the 1790s and was immediately taken with him. This was partly about fashion. George was interested in clothes and style, and Brummell was the best at it. But it was also about something more personal. Brummell provided companionship, wit, and a form of intimacy that was expressed through shared aesthetic interests rather than through political power or emotional confession. They were friends who spent hours together discussing fashion, attending social events, and basically being the most stylish people in any room they entered. The relationship between George and Brummell tells us something about how male intimacy could be performed through aesthetics. This wasn't George showering a favourite with political appointments the way James the Wire had done. Brummell held no official position. What George gave him was access, friendship, and the social cachet that came with being the Prince of Wales's intimate friend. And what Brummell gave George was style, taste, and a way of performing aristocratic masculinity that was different from his father's generation. They were collaborating on creating an aesthetic identity, and that collaboration was intimate even if it wasn't romantic. The friendship eventually fell apart over a combination of Brummell's gambling debts, his increasing rudeness to people who could have helped him, and his apparent belief that being the arbiter of taste made him immune to the normal rules of social hierarchy. He insulted George once too often in public, and George cut him off. Brummell ended up fleeing to France to escape his creditors and died there in poverty and madness in 1840. It's a sad ending to what had been a glittering friendship, and it reminds us that favouritism only worked as long as the person with power continued to favour you. Once that protection was withdrawn, favourites often found themselves very vulnerable very quickly. But what Brummell represented was important beyond just his personal relationship with George. He demonstrated that style itself could be a form of power, that performance of identity through dress and manner could create influence and intimacy. The dandy, as a cultural figure, emerged during this period. Men who devoted enormous time and attention to their appearance, who understood fashion as a form of art and self-expression, and who existed somewhat outside conventional categories of masculinity. Dandyism was coded as potentially deviant or effeminate by critics, but dandies themselves claimed they were actually representing a more refined, more civilized form of masculinity than the hunting and sporting country gentleman model. This is where we get into questions of performativity and identity. The dandy was performing a particular version of masculinity that emphasized aesthetics, refinement, and self-creation. This performance could be read as resistance to conventional gender norms. I refuse to perform masculinity in the expected ways. I'll perform it according to my own aesthetic standards instead. For some men, dandyism was just about fashion. For others, it was a way of coding difference, of signalling to those who could read the signals that they didn't fit conventional categories. The intense friendships between dandies, the aesthetic collaborations, the shared focus on beauty and style, all of this created spaces where certain kinds of same-sex intimacy could exist under the cover of being about fashion rather than about feelings or desire. George IV's relationship with Brummell wasn't unique. He had other favourites and intimate friends throughout his life. But what makes Brummell significant is that he represented a different model of favourite than we'd seen before. Not the political advisor, not the military companion, not the emotional support, but the aesthetic collaborator. The relationship was performed through style and taste, and that performance created its own form of intimacy. Whether there was anything sexual about George and Brummell's relationship is something historians debate, but in some ways, that's not the point. What matters is that they found a way to have an intimate male friendship that was publicly acknowledged and celebrated, at least until it fell apart by coding it through shared aesthetic interests. Now we should talk about William Frederick, Duke of Gloucester, because his story shows yet another variation on this theme. William Frederick was George III's nephew, a member of the royal family who never had a shot at the throne but who carved out his own identity through style and social performance. He was known for his elaborate dress, his refined manners, and his careful cultivation of aesthetic sensibility. Contemporary observers noted that he was particular about his appearance and took great care with his dress, which in the language of the time could signal various things. What's interesting about William Frederick is that he operated in royal circles but somewhat outside the direct line of succession, which gave him a degree of freedom that heirs to the throne didn't have. He could afford to be more eccentric, more focused on aesthetic concerns, more willing to violate conventional expectations of princely behaviour. He never married until late in life, and when he did, it was to his cousin in what seems to have been largely a political and practical arrangement, rather than a romantic attachment. His emotional life seems to have been focused on his male friends and companions, with whom he shared aesthetic interests and social activities. The concept of aesthetic sovereignty is useful here. William Frederick created a space of autonomy for himself through his aesthetic choices and social performances. He couldn't have political sovereignty, he wasn't king and never would be, but he could have aesthetic sovereignty, defining his own standards of taste and refinement, and gathering around himself people who shared those standards. This created a kind of alternative court, a social circle defined by aesthetic sensibility rather than political power, and within that circle, different kinds of relationships and identities were possible. The Georgian period saw the development of increasingly sophisticated codes of fashion and behaviour that could signal different identities and affinities. The way a man tied his cravat, the cut of his coat, the style of his hair, the manner of his speech, all of these could be read by those who knew how to read them. Some of this was just about social class and taste, but some of it was about signalling other kinds of identity and finding other people who shared those identities. The dandy subculture created spaces where men could be intimate with each other in ways that were socially acknowledged, but also somewhat protected because they were coded as being about aesthetics rather than about anything else. This is different from the medieval and Stuart periods where relationships were coded through political favour and emotional attachment. Now we're seeing relationships coded through style, taste and aesthetic collaboration. The intimacy is still there, but it's being performed through different means. And what's particularly interesting is that this allowed for more public acknowledgement in some ways. George and Brummell's friendship was famous. Everyone knew about it. It was discussed in society. It was part of both men's public identities. But because it was framed as being about fashion and wit rather than about emotional or physical intimacy, it could be publicly acknowledged in ways that more explicitly romantic attachments couldn't be. The role of fashion in royal identity during this period can't be overstated. Kings and princes were always fashion leaders. What they wore influenced what the court wore, which influenced what society wore. But during the Georgian period, this became more deliberate and more coded. Fashion choices became ways of making statements about identity, values, and affiliations. A king who dressed conservatively was making one statement. A prince who dressed in the latest style was making another. And the people chosen to advise on these fashion choices, the friends with whom style was discussed and collaborated on, occupied positions of intimacy and influence. The performance aspect is crucial. Royal identity has always been performed. The whole point of monarchy is that it's a theatrical institution, a performance of power and legitimacy. But during the Georgian period, that performance became more self-conscious and more varied. There were different ways to perform royal masculinity, and the choice of which way to perform it said something about the individual. A prince who chose to perform through military valour made different statements than a prince who chose to perform through aesthetic refinement. And the people who helped create and maintain these performances, the companions, advisors, and friends who were part of constructing the public identity, were intimately involved in that process. This brings us back to the question of what these relationships were really about. Were William III and Bentinck lovers? Were George Thorpe and Brummell? The evidence is ambiguous in different ways for each case. But maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe what matters more is understanding how these relationships functioned, what they meant to the people involved, what they enabled, how they were understood by contemporaries, and what they tell us about the possibilities for same-sex intimacy in different historical contexts. What we can say is that the late 17th and 18th centuries saw the development of increasingly sophisticated ways of coding same-sex relationships through aesthetics, style, and performance. The relationships between kings or princes and their favourites became less about overt emotional dependency, though that still existed, and more about collaboration in creating public identities through fashion, taste, and manners. This didn't make the relationships less intimate. If anything, the aesthetic collaboration could be deeply intimate, involving shared standards of beauty, joint decisions about self-presentation, and the creation of social spaces where particular identities could be performed and celebrated. The Dutch influence William III brought was part of a broader pattern of cultural exchange that shaped how English royalty understood and performed identity. Continental courts had different traditions and different attitudes, and as English royalty increasingly interacted with and sometimes came from these other cultures, they brought new possibilities for how relationships could be structured and expressed. The Dutch had their own traditions of male friendship and intimacy. The French had theirs. The Italians had theirs. When these traditions mixed with English culture, new hybrid forms emerged. The Georgian period, with its emphasis on refinement, taste, and social performance, provided particular opportunities for same-sex relationships to exist in socially acknowledged ways, as long as they were properly coded. The dandy culture was explicitly about men who devoted themselves to aesthetics and who formed intense friendships with other men around shared taste. Not every dandy was gay, but the cultural space dandyism created allowed for kinds of same-sex intimacy that might not have been possible in other contexts. It provided a language and a set of practices through which intimacy could be expressed and acknowledged without having to be explicitly named as romantic or sexual. For royal figures, this aesthetic coding provided a way to have favourites and intimate companions while maintaining plausible deniability about the nature of the relationships. George III could be intimate friends with Beau Brummel, and as long as it was framed as being about shared interest in fashion and style, it could be publicly acknowledged and celebrated. If anyone suggested there was more to it than that, well, they were just being vulgar and not understanding the refined nature of aesthetic friendship. The coding provided protection while still allowing the relationship to exist in public view. William Frederick, Duke of Gloucester, used this aesthetic coding throughout his life. By being known primarily for his refined taste and careful attention to dress and manners, he created a public identity that allowed for eccentricity and difference without having to specify exactly what that difference was. He could surround himself with male friends who shared his aesthetic interests. He could remain unmarried for decades without too much comment, and he could perform a version of princely identity that was different from the conventional model without facing the kind of accusations and attacks that earlier royal figures had faced. The question of whether these relationships were sexual often misses the broader point about how same-sex intimacy could be structured and experienced in these periods. Physical sexuality might have been part of some relationships and not others, but the relationships were intimate regardless. They involved deep friendship, emotional connection, shared identity creation, and the kind of closeness that shapes a person's sense of self and place in the world. The aesthetic collaboration, the hours spent discussing fashion and attending events together, the creation of shared social circles and cultural spaces, all of this was intimate even when it wasn't explicitly sexual. What the Georgian period shows us is that as society became more sophisticated about reading and performing identity through style and manners, the possibilities for coding same-sex relationships also became more sophisticated. You didn't have to have the dramatic emotional outpourings of the Stuarts. You could have intense male friendships that were acknowledged and celebrated, as long as they were framed in ways that society could accept, as being about aesthetics, or wit, or shared intellectual interests, or any number of other things that provided plausible explanations for why two men were constantly in each other's company and clearly devoted to each other. This sophistication came with its own constraints, of course. The relationships had to be performed correctly to maintain their social acceptability. Too much emotional display might break the illusion that it was just about shared aesthetic interests. Too much violation of gender norms might invite accusations and attacks. The coding provided freedom but also required constant management and performance. Royal figures had to balance their personal attachments with political necessity and social expectations, threading a needle between having the relationships they wanted and maintaining their status and authority. The architecture of royal residences tells part of this story too. The private staircases connecting apartments, the spaces designed for intimate conversation away from the public rooms, the careful arrangement of who had access to which parts of the palace. All of this was designed to facilitate certain kinds of relationships while maintaining the fiction that proper boundaries were being observed. William III's arrangement with Bentinck, where their apartments were connected, wasn't unique. Royal residences throughout this period had these kinds of arrangements, allowing for private meetings and relationships while the public spaces maintained appropriate formality. Fashion itself became a language during this period, one that allowed for expression of identity in increasingly nuanced ways. The colour of a coat, the style of a cravat, the way hair was arranged. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were statements about who you were and what groups you belonged to. For men who were attracted to other men, fashion could provide a way of signalling that identity to others who could read the signals, while remaining opaque to those who couldn't or didn't want to. It was a form of code that operated in plain sight, visible to those in the know but invisible to everyone else. The friendships between royal figures and their aesthetic companions often lasted decades and shaped both men's lives profoundly, even when they were never explicitly acknowledged as romantic relationships. These were partnerships in creating identity and navigating social worlds, collaborations in performing particular versions of masculinity and aristocratic identity. Whether they involved physical sexuality is something we often can't determine from the historical record, but the emotional significance and the intimate nature of the relationships is clear from how they functioned and what they meant to the people involved. What we see across the late 17th and 18th centuries is an evolution in how royal same-sex relationships could be expressed and acknowledged. The raw emotional intensity and political favoritism of earlier periods didn't disappear, but new modes emerged that were more subtle and more theatrical. The language of aesthetics and performance provided new ways to code intimacy and create spaces where different kinds of relationships were possible. This wasn't necessarily progress. Different modes have different possibilities and limitations, but it shows how same-sex relationships adapted to changing social contexts, finding new languages and new performances through which intimacy could be expressed and acknowledged within the constraints of what society would accept. The 19th century presents us with a fascinating paradox. On one hand, Victorian Britain was supposedly the height of moral propriety, respectability, and rigid social codes about proper behaviour. On the other hand, the gap between what Victorian society claimed to believe and what actually happened behind closed doors was so enormous you could drive a carriage through it, which people probably did on their way to various scandalous establishments that officially didn't exist. The Victorian era perfected the art of public morality and private transgression, and nowhere was this more evident than in the royal family, where maintaining the appearance of virtue while managing actual behaviour created some truly spectacular contradictions. What makes the Victorian period particularly interesting for our purposes is that this was when the modern press really came into its own. There were newspapers everywhere, eager to report on scandal but also constrained by libel laws and social conventions about what could be printed regarding the royal family. This created a situation where everyone knew things were happening, journalists investigated and wrote about them, but then the stories got suppressed or buried or carefully worded so that readers could read between the lines without anyone actually saying anything actionable. It's like the entire society was engaged in an elaborate game where everyone pretended not to know things that everybody actually knew. Let's start with Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie, who was Queen Victoria's grandson and second in line to the throne after his father, the future Edward VII. Eddie has become something of a historical enigma, partly because he died young at age 28, partly because various conspiracy theories have attached themselves to him over the years, including the completely unfounded claim that he was Jack the Ripper, which is absurd but tells you something about how his reputation evolved after his death. What's actually documented about Eddie is complicated enough without adding fictional murders. Eddie was, by most contemporary accounts, not the sharpest tool in the royal shed. His tutors despaired of him. His family worried about him. He seemed to drift through life without much purpose or direction, which is actually somewhat understandable given that his main job was to wait around for his father to die, so his father could wait around for his grandmother to die so he could become king. It's not exactly a career path that encourages initiative. The royal family tried to find things for Eddie to do, military service, public appearances, tours of the empire, but he never seemed to excel at anything or show much interest in his royal duties. What Eddie was interested in, according to various sources and rumours that circulated during his life and after his death, was pleasure. He liked parties, he liked socialising, and he apparently liked the company of both men and women in ways that made his family nervous. The specific scandal that would become most famous in connection with Eddie was the Cleveland Street affair of 1889, which was one of the most notorious scandals of the Victorian era and one that the establishment worked very hard to suppress. The Cleveland Street scandal began when police discovered a male brothel operating at 19 Cleveland Street in London. This wasn't just any brothel. It catered specifically to aristocratic and upper-class clients who were interested in young men, many of whom were telegraph boys from the post office who were supplementing their meagre wages through sex work. When the police raided the establishment and began investigating, they discovered that the clientele included some very prominent names. Names that, if made public, would cause enormous scandal and potentially bring down important people. Several aristocrats were implicated, including Lord Arthur Somerset, who was an equerry to the Prince of Wales. That is, he was part of Eddie's father's household. Somerset fled to France before he could be prosecuted, which was convenient for everyone involved because it meant there wouldn't be a trial where embarrassing details might emerge. But the really explosive rumour that began circulating was that Prince Albert Victor himself had been a client of the Cleveland Street establishment, that he had been caught up in the investigation, and that the whole thing was being covered up to protect the royal family. The evidence for Eddie's involvement is complicated and contested. No contemporaneous police documents explicitly name him, but there are references in private letters and diaries suggesting that people at the time believed he was involved. There's also the fact that the government went to extraordinary lengths to suppress information about the case, which seemed excessive if it was just about protecting minor aristocrats. The trials that did occur were managed to minimize testimony about prominent clients. Journalists who tried to report on the scandal were threatened with libel suits. The whole thing reeked of cover-up, which naturally made people more convinced that there was something significant being covered up. One particularly interesting piece of evidence comes from the papers of Lord Arthur Somerset, which suggest that he and Eddie knew each other well and moved in the same social circles. Some historians have interpreted this as circumstantial evidence that Eddie might have been part of the same underground scene that Somerset was involved in. Others have argued that knowing someone who frequented male brothels doesn't mean you frequented them yourself, which is fair but also doesn't explain why the cover-up was so extensive. What we can say with confidence is that the Cleveland Street scandal revealed the existence of a thriving underground world of same-sex relationships and commerce in Victorian London, that this world included aristocratic clients who had money and power, and that when the scandal threatened to expose prominent people, the establishment closed ranks to protect them. Whether Eddie was actually involved or just rumoured to be involved, the scandal shaped his reputation and contributed to perceptions of him as dissolute and morally questionable. The Victorian response to the Cleveland Street scandal is instructive. The government's position was essentially nothing to see here, move along, while simultaneously working frantically behind the scenes to suppress information and protect the people involved. The newspapers reported on the case but in carefully coded language that avoided naming names or giving specific details about what actually occurred at Cleveland Street. Readers had to read between the lines to understand what was being discussed, and this created a situation where everyone knew but nobody officially knew, which is the Victorian way of handling uncomfortable truths. For Eddie, the scandal contributed to his family's concern about his behaviour and his fitness for eventually becoming king. There were serious discussions about whether he should be married off quickly to a suitable princess who could settle him down and provide the appearance of conventional domesticity. The woman chosen was Princess Mary of Teck, who after Eddie's unexpected death from influenza in 1892 would go on to marry his younger brother George, the future George V. So Mary of Teck's job was essentially to be the respectable wife who would make whichever prince needed settling down look more conventional, which she performed admirably for George, if not for Eddie. Eddie's death at 28 cut short whatever his life might have become, and it also allowed his reputation to be somewhat rehabilitated. In death, he could be mourned as a promising young prince cut down in his prime, rather than having to deal with whatever scandals might have emerged if he'd lived to become king. The Cleveland Street affair faded from public discussion, helped along by official suppression, and Eddie became one of those forgotten royal figures whose actual life gets obscured by rumour and speculation. But his story tells us something important about Victorian royal life. The standards of public morality were incredibly strict. Royalty had to be seen as virtuous, respectable, and morally upright. But the actual behaviour of royal figures was often quite different from the public image, and managing the gap between appearance and reality required constant work. When scandals threatened to expose that gap, the establishment's response was to suppress, to cover up, to protect the institution even at the cost of honesty. Now let's talk about Frederick, Prince of Wales, though we have to be careful here because there were multiple princes of Wales named Frederick in British history. The one we're interested in is the one who lived in the 18th century, Frederick Louis, who was the father of George III and who died before his own father, George VI, which meant he never became king. Frederick is one of those forgotten royals who gets overshadowed by the more dramatic figures around him, but his story is actually quite interesting in terms of how he navigated expectations and his own inclinations. Frederick was born in 1707 in Hanover, before his family inherited the British throne, and he spent his first years in Germany before being brought to England as a teenager when his grandfather became George the Rus. His relationship with his parents, particularly his father, George II, was terrible. They genuinely seemed to loathe each other, which was something of a family tradition in the House of Hanover, where fathers and sons had a remarkable talent for mutual hatred. Frederick's parents thought he was frivolous and irresponsible. Frederick thought his parents were tyrannical and refused to give him enough money or independence. It was a functional family dynamic that surely didn't cause any psychological issues whatsoever. As Prince of Wales, Frederick was expected to marry and produce heirs, which he did. He married Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha in 1736, and they had 9 children together, so he certainly fulfilled that duty. But his personal life and social circle raised eyebrows among those who paid attention. Frederick surrounded himself with young men, artists and intellectuals, creating a court at Leicester House that was known for being more culturally sophisticated and more relaxed about social conventions than his father's court at St. Beant, James's palace. This was partly political. Frederick's court became a gathering place for opposition politicians who disliked George II, but it was also personal. Frederick clearly preferred the company of the people he gathered around him to the stiff formality of his father's court. Contemporary sources describe Frederick's favourites and companions in ways that sometimes suggest more than just political alliance or conventional friendship. One of his closest companions was Lord Hervey, who was himself a fascinating figure. Married with children, but also openly in a relationship with Stephen Fox for years, writing love letters to Fox that were explicit enough that their eventual publication in the 20th century caused some historical pearl-clutching. Hervey and Frederick were extremely close for a time, though they later fell out spectacularly, and Hervey wrote some very unflattering things about Frederick in his memoirs. The friendship between Frederick and Hervey was intense enough that it attracted comment from contemporaries, who suggested there was something unusual about it. Hervey had access to Frederick at all hours, they exchanged letters frequently, and they clearly had an emotional intimacy that went beyond normal courtier-prince relationships. When they fell out, it was with the bitterness of a personal betrayal rather than just a political disagreement. The exact nature of their relationship is debated by historians. Hervey was clearly bisexual by any modern understanding, but whether Frederick was, or whether their relationship was romantic or just intensely friendly, we can't determine with certainty. What we can say is that Frederick created around himself a social world that was more permissive and less conventional than his father's court, that he gathered friends and companions who were themselves living somewhat outside conventional norms, and that his personal relationships sometimes crossed boundaries that made even the relatively sophisticated 18th century court raise eyebrows. He also patronised the arts extensively, supported opera and theatre, and generally performed a version of princely identity that emphasised cultural sophistication over military valour or political gravitas. Frederick died in 1751 at age 44, officially from a lung injury caused by being hit by a cricket ball, though the actual cause was probably an infection from an abscess. Like Eddie after him, Frederick's early death meant he never had to deal with becoming king, and it also meant his reputation could be shaped by others. His son, George III, turned out to be very different from him, conventional, morally strict, deeply religious, which suggests either Frederick's influence on his son was limited, or George was deliberately choosing to be different from his father. The contrast between these two Fredericks, Frederick Prince of Wales in the 18th century and Prince Albert Victor in the 19th, tells us something about how Victorian morality changed things. Frederick Louis lived in a period when aristocratic behaviour was relatively permissive, when having favourites and creating alternative social circles was more accepted, when the gap between public propriety and private behaviour was acknowledged with a kind of sophisticated worldliness. By Eddie's time, that worldliness had been replaced with rigid moral standards and intense hypocrisy. The behaviours that might have been tolerated or merely gossiped about in Frederick's time required elaborate cover-ups and suppression in Eddie's time. Victorian morality created a peculiar situation for royalty. On one hand, the standards of public behaviour became stricter. Royalty had to be moral exemplars, paragons of virtue, symbols of respectable family values. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert deliberately crafted this image of the royal family as the ideal of domestic propriety, which was actually quite new. Earlier royal families hadn't claimed to be moral exemplars. They claimed to be powerful, legitimate, ordained by God, but not necessarily virtuous in the Victorian sense. But Victoria changed that, creating an expectation that royalty should be both powerful and morally perfect. This created enormous pressure on royal family members to maintain appearances. Any behaviour that deviated from the strict Victorian moral code had to be hidden, suppressed, or explained away. The gap between public image and private reality became a source of constant anxiety and management. And when scandals did emerge, like Cleveland Street, the response was to deny, to cover up, to protect the institution at all costs. Truth mattered less than maintaining the facade. The hypocrisy was remarkable. Victorian Britain was full of prostitution, both female and male. London had hundreds of brothels and thousands of sex workers. The underground world of same-sex relationships and encounters was extensive, with its own geography of meeting places, its own codes and signals, its own communities. All of this existed and was known to exist. But it couldn't be officially acknowledged because that would violate the fiction of Victorian moral propriety. So instead, you had this elaborate dance where everyone knew things but nobody could say them, where the underground world flourished precisely because the official world refused to acknowledge it existed. For royal figures like Eddie, this created an impossible situation. If he was indeed involved in same-sex relationships or encounters, he was hardly unique. Plenty of aristocratic men were navigating that same underground world. But his position meant that any scandal involving him would be magnified enormously and would threaten the carefully constructed image of royal virtue. So the establishment had to protect him even if it meant covering up truth, suppressing evidence, and allowing guilty people to escape prosecution. The institution mattered more than justice or honesty. The telegraph boys involved in the Cleveland Street scandal were working-class young men making poverty wages who supplemented their income through sex work. When the scandal broke, several of them were prosecuted and imprisoned. The aristocratic clients, meanwhile, either fled the country or were protected from prosecution. This class dimension was typical of Victorian morality. The people with the least power bore the brunt of punishment while the powerful were protected. Morality was enforced selectively, with the harshest consequences falling on those least able to defend themselves. The press coverage of Cleveland Street illustrates the Victorian approach to scandal. Newspapers reported on the case, but in language so circumspect that modern readers have to work to understand what was being discussed. They talked about a certain kind of house, and nameless offences and vices too terrible to name. This created a situation where educated readers who were sophisticated enough could understand what was being referenced, but the details remained obscure enough that the newspapers couldn't be accused of corrupting public morals by being too explicit. It was scandal reporting for people who already knew enough to understand the code. Some newspapers tried to push boundaries and be more explicit, and they were threatened with prosecution for obscene libel. The message was clear. You could report on scandal as long as you stayed within acceptable bounds of vagueness, but if you tried to actually inform readers about what specifically happened, you'd be prosecuted. This meant that the truth of scandals remained somewhat obscure, filtered through layers of euphemism and circumlocution that protected the guilty while supposedly protecting public morals. The Victorian period also saw the development of psychology and sexology as fields of study, and these new sciences created new language for discussing same-sex desire. The term homosexual was coined in the 1860s in German and gradually made its way into English, bringing with it a new framework for understanding same-sex attraction as a type of identity rather than just a set of behaviours. This was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided language for people to understand their own experiences and identities. On the other hand, it created a new category of deviance that could be medicalised, pathologized, and prosecuted. The Labouchere Amendment of 1885 criminalised all male homosexual acts in Britain, even those occurring in private between consenting adults. This was the law under which Oscar Wilde was prosecuted a decade later, and it remained on the books until 1967. The Cleveland Street scandal occurred just 4 years after this law was passed, which partly explains the intensity of the cover-up. The legal consequences had become much more severe, and the possibility of royal family members being prosecuted under this law was unthinkable to the establishment. What the Cleveland Street scandal and Eddie's rumoured involvement reveal is how precarious royal reputations had become in the Victorian period. In earlier eras, kings could have favourites and everyone knew it, and it was managed through court politics and power dynamics. But by the late 19th century, the public moral standards were so strict and the legal consequences so severe that even rumours of involvement in same-sex activities could be devastating. The cost of maintaining the royal family's moral image was constant surveillance, suppression, and cover-up. For princes like Eddie, who may have had same-sex attractions or who may have just been exploring the available pleasures of urban life without thinking too carefully about consequences, the Victorian moral system created a trap. They couldn't openly be who they were or do what they wanted because that would violate the image of royal virtue. But they also couldn't always control their desires or behaviours, especially if they were young and not particularly thoughtful. The result was vulnerability to scandal, and when scandals emerged, the response was cover-up rather than honesty. The forgotten nature of both Frederick and Eddie is itself instructive. Frederick never became king, so his life and relationships faded from historical memory, overshadowed by his son George III's long and eventful reign. Eddie died young before becoming king, and his family was probably relieved that they didn't have to manage his reputation as monarch. Both princes exist in the historical record as somewhat marginal figures, noted mostly for not becoming king rather than for what they actually did with their lives. But their stories matter because they show us how royal figures navigated the expectations and constraints of their time, how they created spaces for relationships and behaviours that deviated from norms, and how those behaviours were managed or suppressed by the institution. The Victorian period created a particular form of hypocrisy that was different from earlier eras. It wasn't that earlier periods didn't have hypocrisy. They absolutely did. But earlier hypocrisy was more about power and politics. Kings could do things that ordinary people couldn't because they were kings, and everyone understood that power came with privileges even if those privileges were sometimes abused. Victorian hypocrisy was more about morality. The claim was that everyone, including royalty, should live according to strict moral codes. But in practice, the powerful could violate those codes as long as they maintained appearances, while the powerless were punished severely for the same behaviours. This created a system where truth became subordinate to appearance. What mattered wasn't whether royal figures actually lived virtuous lives, but whether they appeared to live virtuous lives. Scandals were managed not by addressing the behaviour, but by suppressing information about the behaviour. The press cooperated in this system, reporting on scandals in ways that were more about titillation than revelation, using euphemisms that preserved plausible deniability, while still giving readers enough information to understand that something scandalous had occurred. For historians trying to understand what actually happened in cases like Cleveland Street, this creates enormous challenges. The contemporary sources are deliberately vague. Documents were destroyed or suppressed. People who knew things were pressured not to talk. What we're left with is fragments, rumours, and circumstantial evidence that has to be carefully evaluated. We know there was a male brothel. We know aristocrats frequented it. We know the government covered things up. But exactly which aristocrats, exactly what happened, exactly who knew what, much of this remains murky, which is exactly what the cover-up intended. The impact of Victorian morality on royal life extended beyond just scandals. It shaped how royalty could express themselves, who they could associate with, how they could perform their identities. The pressure to conform to moral expectations was constant and intense. This was particularly difficult for royal figures who didn't fit the mould, who were attracted to people of the same sex, who wanted to live differently from what was expected, who found the strictures of Victorian propriety suffocating. For them, royal life meant either constant performance of a false self or constant risk of exposure and scandal. The contrast between the 18th century world Frederick inhabited and the 19th century world Eddie inhabited is stark. Frederick could create an alternative court, surround himself with artists and favourites, patronise the arts, and live a life that was culturally sophisticated and somewhat outside conventional norms. He faced criticism and conflict with his father, but his lifestyle was tolerated as within the range of acceptable aristocratic behaviour. Eddie, living a century later, faced much stricter constraints. The underground world where same-sex encounters occurred still existed, but it was criminalised, stigmatised, and dangerous. For a royal figure to be caught up in it meant not just personal scandal, but institutional crisis. The forgotten nature of these princes also reflects how history treats royal figures who don't fit the narrative. The successful kings, the dramatic reigns, the major political events, these get remembered and studied. But princes who died young, who never became king, who were involved in suppressed scandals, who lived lives that their families would rather forget, these fade from historical memory. Their stories get lost or distorted, known primarily through rumours and speculation rather than clear documentation. We remember them, if at all, for what they didn't become rather than for who they were. Yet their stories matter precisely because they show us the constraints and contradictions of royal life in their respective eras. They show us how the gap between public morality and private behaviour was managed, how scandals were suppressed, how reputations were shaped and reshaped after death. They give us glimpses into the underground worlds that existed alongside the official world of court and politics. And they remind us that behind the formal portraits and official chronicles, there were actual human beings trying to navigate impossible expectations, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing, but always operating within systems that constrained their choices and shaped their possibilities. The Victorian period's legacy of hypocrisy and suppression would continue well into the 20th century, shaping how royal scandals were managed and how royal figures who deviated from norms had to navigate their lives. The patterns established in the 19th century The cover-ups, the suppressions, the careful management of information, the gap between public morality and private behaviour would continue to define royal life for generations. Understanding the Victorian moment helps us understand not just that period, but how it shaped everything that came after, creating systems of secrecy and protection that persist in different forms even today. Now we need to talk about the Scottish royal tradition, because it was different from the English one in some interesting ways, and those differences tell us something about how same-sex relationships could be navigated in different political and cultural contexts. Scotland was its own kingdom until 1707, with its own court culture, its own political dynamics, and its own ways of handling the personal lives of monarchs. The Scottish court was generally smaller, poorer, and less formal than the English court, which created both constraints and opportunities. There was less elaborate ceremony, which meant less rigid structure to navigate. But there was also less documentation, which means we know less about what actually happened behind closed doors. The Scottish approach to uncomfortable truths about royal behaviour was often simply not to talk about them. This wasn't the elaborate Victorian cover-up system where scandals were actively suppressed through legal threats and document destruction. It was more subtle, a cultural tendency toward discretion, toward not asking questions that might have uncomfortable answers, toward allowing ambiguity to remain ambiguous rather than forcing everything into explicit acknowledgement. Silence as strategy rather than silence as cover-up, though the practical effect was often similar. Let's start with James IV, who ruled Scotland from 1488 to 1513, and who presents us with an interesting puzzle about performed masculinity and actual desire. James Thaw is generally remembered as one of Scotland's more successful medieval kings. He was energetic, politically astute, interested in arts and learning, and he managed to maintain relative stability during his reign until his catastrophic defeat and death at the Battle of Flodden. The chronicles paint him as the model of medieval kingship, martial, cultured, pious, and definitely interested in women, with numerous mistresses and acknowledged illegitimate children to prove it. The official narrative of James IV is aggressively heterosexual. He had at least 6 mistresses that we know of and at least 8 illegitimate children. He married Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England, in a politically significant match that would eventually lead to the Stuart succession to the English throne. His court was known for elaborate festivals and tournaments, where he performed the role of chivalric king. Everything about his public presentation screamed conventional masculine kingship, which is exactly what makes some historians wonder whether all that performance was perhaps compensating for something. The thing about James IV that's interesting is how much energy he put into performing this particular version of masculinity. The tournaments, the military displays, the ostentatious mistresses, it was all very public, very visible, very much about creating a particular image. This could just be what medieval kingship looked like, the expected performance that any king would engage in. But some historians have noted that the performance seems almost excessive, as if James was working unusually hard to establish his credentials as a conventionally masculine, heterosexually active king. There are hints in the sources of male favourites and close companions who had unusual access to James. One chronicler notes that the king had special affection for certain young men at court, though the chronicler doesn't specify what that affection entailed. There are records of generous gifts to particular male courtiers that seem to go beyond standard royal patronage. There are architectural arrangements at James's residences that suggest private access between the king's chambers and those of certain favourites. None of this proves anything definitively, but it creates a pattern that's familiar from other royal courts: the combination of public heterosexual display with private same-sex intimacy. The key phrase here is performative masculinity. James performed a very particular version of kingship that emphasised his prowess with women, his military valour, his chivalric ideals. Whether this performance matched his actual desires, or whether it was creating a public identity that allowed him to have more private freedom, is something we can't determine from the surviving sources. What we can say is that the performance was successful. Contemporary sources and later historians have generally accepted James the Thaw as an example of conventionally masculine kingship, without questioning whether there might have been more complexity to his personal life. The Scottish sources are less likely than English ones to explicitly discuss or even hint at same-sex relationships. This could be because such relationships were less common in Scotland, but more likely it reflects different cultural attitudes about what was appropriate to document. Scottish chroniclers tended to be more laconic, less interested in personal details, more focused on political and military events. This means that the absence of explicit references to same-sex relationships doesn't tell us much. It might mean they weren't happening, or it might mean they were happening but nobody thought it worth writing about, or nobody wanted to write about it, or the writings that did exist didn't survive. James Thurtheff's case illustrates a broader problem with interpreting historical silence. When we don't have evidence of something, is that because it didn't happen, or because it wasn't recorded, or because the records were lost or destroyed? With same-sex relationships in particular, there are so many reasons why they might not appear in historical records even if they existed. The behaviour might have been kept private. It might have been coded in ways we can't recognise. It might have been documented but the documents were destroyed, or chroniclers might have deliberately chosen not to write about it, either out of discretion or because they didn't think it was important, or because they knew writing about it could be dangerous. The fact that James IV performed conventional masculinity so publicly and successfully might have actually given him more freedom privately. If everyone sees the mistresses and the military glory and the chivalric tournaments, they're less likely to look for or notice behaviour that doesn't fit that image. The performance creates a kind of cover that allows for complexity that would be more visible without it. This is speculation, to be clear. We don't have smoking gun evidence that James Thorpe had same-sex relationships. But the pattern of elaborate public performance combined with hints of private complexity is one we've seen before, and it's worth considering as a possibility. Now let's talk about David II, because his case is different and more clearly documented, though still frustratingly incomplete. David became King of Scotland in 1329 at age 5 when his father Robert the Bruce died. He spent much of his youth in exile in France while Scotland was controlled by English forces, then returned as an adult to reclaim his throne. He reigned until 1371, dying at age 46 without legitimate children despite 2 marriages. The absence of heirs was politically significant because it meant the crown passed to the Stuart dynasty through Robert the Bruce's daughter rather than through David's own line. David's first marriage was to Joan of England, daughter of Edward II. Yes, the same Edward II we discussed earlier with his favourites. Joan and David married when they were both children as part of a peace treaty, so there was never much expectation of romantic attachment. But they were married for over 30 years, and Joan never became pregnant. When Joan died in 1362, David waited a year and then married Margaret Drummond, who also never became pregnant. David died childless, which meant over 40 years of marriage to 2 different women without producing a single legitimate heir. Now, not producing heirs doesn't automatically tell us anything about someone's sexuality. There are many reasons medieval couples didn't have children. Fertility issues could affect either partner, couples might have been living apart for political or personal reasons, there might have been health problems we don't know about. But the complete absence of children over such a long period, combined with other aspects of David's life, has led historians to wonder whether the marriages were ever consummated, and if not, why not? What makes David's case more suggestive is what chroniclers said about his personal life. There are references to his intimate companions and to favourites at court who seem to have unusual influence. One chronicle notes that David delighted more in the company of certain young men than in the company of his wife, which is language we've seen before in discussions of other kings. Another source mentions that David gave generous gifts and appointments to particular male courtiers in ways that caused grumbling among the Scottish nobility, who felt they were being overlooked in favour of the king's favourites. The sources also note that David's second marriage to Margaret Drummond was deeply unpopular with the nobility and with the church. The marriage was contracted quickly without proper consultation with his advisers, and many people saw it as David elevating a woman of relatively low status to queenship for personal reasons rather than political advantage. Some historians have suggested that this marriage was actually a cover for David's same-sex relationships. By marrying someone who was not politically powerful and didn't have strong family connections to complicate matters, David was free to continue his actual emotional and possibly sexual life with male favourites, while maintaining the appearance of conventional marriage. What's particularly interesting about David the Sioux is that there don't seem to have been intense efforts to produce an heir. In many cases where medieval kings had fertility issues in their marriages, there would be intense political pressure to resolve the problem, to try different wives, to consult doctors, to do whatever was necessary to produce an heir. With David, there's a kind of resignation in the sources. People noted that he had no children. It was recognised as a political problem because it meant the succession would pass to another line. But there doesn't seem to have been the kind of urgent pressure to fix the situation that you might expect. This could suggest that people at court understood why David wasn't producing heirs and knew that pressure wouldn't help. The Scottish sources handle David's situation with their characteristic reticence. They note the facts, No children, close male companions, 2 marriages that don't seem to have been particularly intimate, but they don't elaborate or speculate explicitly. The silence creates ambiguity that can be read multiple ways. Were David's relationships with male favourites romantic or sexual? Did his contemporaries understand them that way? Was the absence of heirs related to his orientation or to other factors? The sources give us pieces but not a complete picture. What we can say is that David II's reign presents a pattern that's familiar from other monarchs we've discussed. Close attachments to male favourites, marriages that seem distant or unconsummated, absence of children, and contemporary commentary that hints at something unusual without stating it explicitly. Whether this amounts to evidence that David was gay in any modern sense is debatable, but it clearly indicates that his personal relationships and his approach to marriage and succession were outside the conventional pattern. Now we come to Henry Benedict Stuart, and his story is different again because it's not about silence or ambiguity. It's about a very explicit choice that removed him from conventional expectations entirely. Henry Benedict was born in 1725, the grandson of James II of England, who had been deposed in 1688. The Stuart family had been in exile on the continent since then, maintaining their claim to the British throne and being supported by various Catholic powers who opposed the Protestant Hanoverian dynasty that had replaced them. Henry Benedict was the younger son of James Francis Edward Stuart, known as the Old Pretender, and the younger brother of Charles Edward Stuart, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. When Charles Edward's attempt to reclaim the throne failed disastrously at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, it effectively ended any realistic hope of Stuart restoration. Henry Benedict, watching his family's political dreams collapse, made a choice that was unusual for a potential heir to a throne. He became a Catholic priest, and eventually a cardinal. In 1747, at age 22, Henry Benedict entered the church. His decision shocked many Stuart supporters who had hoped he might continue his family's efforts to reclaim the throne. By becoming a priest and taking vows of celibacy, Henry Benedict was explicitly removing himself from the succession in practical terms. He couldn't marry, couldn't produce heirs, couldn't fulfill the basic dynastic duty of a royal claimant. The choice was seen by many as a betrayal of his family's cause, but for Henry Benedict it seems to have been liberating. He rose through church ranks quickly, becoming a cardinal in 1747, the same year he was ordained as a priest. He eventually became Bishop of Frascati, and spent most of his life in Italy, performing his ecclesiastical duties and living comfortably on income from his church positions and his family's remaining resources. When his brother Charles Edward died in 1788 without legitimate children, Henry Benedict technically became the Jacobite claimant to the British throne, though by this point the claim was purely symbolic. He styled himself Henry IX, but he never pursued the claim actively. He was a cardinal, not a king, and he seems to have been content with that choice. The question that historians have asked is why Henry Benedict made this choice. Entering the church was not unusual for younger sons of royal families. It was a respectable career that provided status and income. But taking vows of celibacy when you're potentially an heir to a contested throne is unusual. It suggests either a genuine religious vocation strong enough to override dynastic duty, or it suggests that Henry Benedict had personal reasons for wanting to avoid marriage and conventional family life. Some historians have suggested that Henry Benedict was gay, and that entering the church provided him with a socially acceptable way to avoid marriage, while living a life that could accommodate same-sex relationships more easily than conventional royal life could have. The Catholic Church had a long tradition of accepting men with same-sex attractions as long as they remained celibate and discreet, and the all-male environment of the church hierarchy certainly provided opportunities for intimate friendships that might not have been available elsewhere. Other historians have argued that there's no evidence for this beyond the fact that he never married, and that we shouldn't assume someone's sexuality just because they chose religious life over dynastic duty. What we can say is that Henry Benedict found in the church a life that allowed him to avoid the conventional expectations of royal manhood: marriage, heirs, military leadership, dynastic duty. Whether this was primarily about religious vocation, or about personal inclination, or some combination of both, the choice allowed him to live according to his own needs, rather than his family's expectations. He maintained his identity as a Stuart prince, and his claim to represent the legitimate royal line, but he did so in a way that removed him from the conventional demands of kingship. Henry Benedict lived until 1807, dying at age 82 as the last legitimate Stuart claimant. He was apparently well liked in Rome, known for his charity and his genuine commitment to his ecclesiastical duties. Whether he had intimate relationships with other men during his long life in the church is something we don't know. The discretion expected of clerics combined with the passage of time means we don't have the kind of personal documentation that might reveal such relationships. But his choice to enter the church rather than pursue his dynastic claims remains suggestive and interesting. The Scottish royal tradition, looking at these three figures together, shows us different strategies for navigating the gap between personal inclination and royal expectation. James IV performed conventional masculinity so thoroughly that his public image overshadowed any private complexity. David II existed in a space of documented ambiguity, where everyone knew something was unusual about his marriages and relationships, but nobody stated it explicitly. Henry Benedict removed himself from conventional expectations entirely by entering the church and choosing celibacy over dynastic duty. What ties these stories together is the role of silence and discretion. Scottish sources tend to be less explicit than English ones about royal personal lives. This might reflect smaller courts with less elaborate record-keeping, or it might reflect cultural attitudes that value discretion more highly. Either way, the result is that we have fewer explicit references to same-sex relationships in Scottish royal history, but we also have patterns of behaviour, close male favourites, unconsummated marriages, choices to avoid conventional family life that suggest such relationships existed even when they weren't explicitly documented. The Scottish court culture also seems to have been somewhat more accepting of ambiguity and complexity in royal behaviour. There was less of the intense scrutiny and moral judgment that characterised later English courts, particularly during the Victorian period. Scottish nobles might grumble about a king's favourites getting too much power, but there seems to have been less investment in policing the king's personal morality as long as he was effective politically. This created space for kings to have relationships and make choices that might have been more controversial in England. The geography of Scotland also mattered. The Scottish court moved between different locations, Edinburgh, Stirling, Linlithgow, Falkland, and was generally less centralised than the English court at Westminster. This meant less constant observation, more private space, more opportunity for relationships to develop away from public scrutiny. The smaller size of the Scottish nobility also meant that court politics worked differently. There were fewer competing factions trying to influence the king, which might have meant less weaponisation of the king's personal relationships as political tools. The religious context in Scotland was also significant. Before the Reformation, Scotland was Catholic like England, with the same theological framework for understanding and condemning same-sex behaviour. After the Reformation, Scotland became Presbyterian, which brought its own strict moral codes. But the Scottish Church never quite had the same power over the monarchy that the English Church sometimes wielded. Scottish kings had to navigate church politics, but they were somewhat less constrained by clerical moral judgment than their English counterparts, at least in some periods. What all three of our Scottish figures illustrate is that there were multiple ways to navigate royal expectations around marriage, heirs, and conventional masculine behaviour. James IV met expectations publicly while possibly having private complexity. David II failed to meet expectations, no heirs despite decades of marriage, but seems to have gotten away with it through a combination of political competence and courtly discretion. Henry Benedict rejected expectations entirely by choosing a life that made conventional marriage impossible. The choice to enter the church that Henry Benedict made was available to royal figures throughout this period, but most didn't take it because dynastic duty was considered paramount. The fact that Henry Benedict chose church over dynasty, celibacy over potential heirs, religious life over royal ambition tells us something about his priorities and possibly about his personal life. Whether those priorities were purely about religious vocation or also about avoiding heterosexual marriage and creating space for other kinds of relationships is something we can speculate about but can't prove definitively. The pattern across Scottish royal history is one of greater discretion and less explicit documentation compared to English royal history. This doesn't mean same-sex relationships were less common in Scotland. More likely, it means they were handled differently, discussed less openly, documented more carefully or not at all. The cultural preference for discretion meant that what happened in private could remain private as long as public expectations were met reasonably well. And when public expectations weren't met, as with David II's failure to produce heirs, the response was often a kind of resigned acceptance rather than the aggressive investigation and judgment that might have occurred in other contexts. This Scottish tradition of silence as strategy had advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was that it created space for ambiguity and complexity, allowing royal figures more freedom in their personal lives as long as they performed their public duties adequately. The disadvantage was that it also meant less documentation, less explicit acknowledgement, and therefore less historical evidence for modern researchers trying to understand these relationships. The silence protected people at the time but makes historical reconstruction more difficult. Looking at Scottish royal history alongside English royal history reveals how much cultural context mattered in shaping how same-sex relationships could exist and be understood. The same behaviours, male favourites, distant marriages, absence of heirs, could be interpreted and managed very differently depending on whether you were at the Scottish court or the English court, whether you were in the medieval period or the Victorian period, whether your society valued discretion or demanded explicit moral judgment. What remains consistent across all these contexts is that royal figures found ways to navigate the gap between personal desire and public expectation. Some performed conventional masculinity while having private complexity. Some existed in documented ambiguity that everyone knew about but nobody stated explicitly. Some removed themselves from conventional expectations entirely by choosing alternative life paths. The strategies varied, but the underlying need to find space for authentic self while meeting the demands of royal duty was constant. The Scottish tradition of handling these matters through silence and discretion might seem less honest than the explicit documentation we have from periods like the Stuart era in England, but it also might have been kinder to the people involved, allowing them to live their lives without constant scrutiny and judgment. The Victorian system of covering up scandals and maintaining false public images was arguably more damaging than the Scottish system of simply not talking about things that didn't need to be talked about. There's something to be said for a culture that values discretion over exposure, that allows ambiguity to remain ambiguous rather than forcing everything into explicit categories. The three Scottish monarchs we've discussed, James IV with his performative masculinity, David II with his unexplained childlessness, and Henry Benedict with his choice of celibacy, show us different ways of being royal and male, in contexts where same-sex desire was possible, but not speakable. They navigated their situations with varying degrees of success, using the tools available to them in their particular times and contexts. Their stories remind us that royal history is full of complexity, ambiguity, and silence that tells its own stories if we're willing to listen for what's not being said as much as for what is. The 20th century changed everything about how royal personal lives worked, and yet somehow also changed nothing at all. On one hand, you had the rise of mass media, photography, film, and eventually television, which meant royal figures were more visible and more documented than ever before. On the other hand, you had increasingly sophisticated systems for managing information and controlling narratives, which meant that even with all this documentation, certain things could still be kept hidden, or at least officially denied. The codes of silence didn't disappear in the 20th century. They just evolved, becoming more complex and more deliberately managed as the stakes for maintaining royal reputation became higher in an age of mass communication. What's particularly interesting about the 20th century is how it created the concept of the open secret, information that everyone in certain circles knows, but that isn't officially acknowledged or publicly discussed. This is different from earlier periods where information was simply hidden, or where only court insiders knew things. Now you could have situations where journalists knew things, aristocratic circles knew things, even significant portions of the educated public knew things, but as long as nobody said them out loud in print or on camera, the fiction of ignorance could be maintained. It was Victorian hypocrisy updated for the media age, with the added twist that the effort required to maintain the fiction became increasingly absurd as communication technology improved. Let's start with Prince George, Duke of Kent, because his story perfectly illustrates this 20th century phenomenon of the open secret. George was the fourth son of King George V and Queen Mary, born in 1902, which meant he was never likely to become king, but was still close enough to the throne to matter. He was handsome, charming, stylish, and apparently deeply uncomfortable with the constraints of royal life as his parents understood it. George V and Queen Mary were the epitome of stuffy royal respectability, duty, service, moral rectitude, and absolutely no public acknowledgement of anything that might be considered scandalous. Their son George was, shall we say, not naturally inclined toward that model of royal behaviour. From his youth, George had a reputation for being wild. He hung out with fashionable society, went to parties, was part of the artistic and cultural scene in London and Paris. He was friends with Noel Coward, who was openly gay in every way except legally saying it out loud because that would have gotten him prosecuted. He was part of a social circle that included artists, actors, musicians, and various aristocrats who were living lives that would have horrified his parents if they'd known the full details, which they probably did know, at least in general terms, but chose not to acknowledge because acknowledging it would require doing something about it. The rumours about George started early and were remarkably persistent. He was linked romantically with various women, which was expected and even encouraged. A young prince should sow some wild oats, as long as he eventually settled down with an appropriate wife. But he was also linked with various men, and these rumours circulated in exactly the circles that could ruin a royal reputation if they became too public. The stories varied. Some suggested he had a relationship with Noel Coward, others mentioned other men in his social circle. Some rumours were probably true, some were probably exaggerated, and some were probably completely invented. The problem for historians is that distinguishing between these categories is nearly impossible, because everyone who knew anything had strong incentives not to talk. What makes George's case distinctive is how widely the rumours spread while remaining officially unacknowledged. This wasn't just court gossip anymore. Journalists knew about the rumours. American newspapers, which were less constrained by British libel laws and royal deference, sometimes published veiled references to George's lifestyle. Society columns would note who George was seen with at parties, and sophisticated readers could decode what was being implied. But British newspapers largely avoided the topic, partly out of deference to the monarchy, and partly because being too explicit could result in legal consequences. The other major rumour about George was that he'd had a drug problem, specifically with cocaine and morphine. This one seems to have more solid backing. There are letters and accounts from people who knew him suggesting that he did go through a period of serious drug use in the 1920s. Whether this was related to his personal struggles with his sexuality and the constraints of royal life, or whether it was just what some people in fashionable society were doing at the time, we can't know for certain. But the combination of rumours, drugs, same-sex relationships, wild parties, artistic friends, created a picture of a royal figure who was living very differently from what the public image of monarchy required. George's family intervened multiple times to try to settle him down. They got him various royal appointments and positions that were meant to give him purpose and structure. And in 1934 they found him a bride, Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, who was beautiful, sophisticated, and apparently willing to marry George, despite whatever she knew or suspected about his personal life. The wedding was a major public event, celebrated as a romantic royal love story, and it did seem to stabilise George's life to some degree. They had 3 children together, and George apparently made an effort to fulfil his royal duties more conscientiously. But here's what's interesting. The marriage didn't stop the rumours. They continued circulating, though perhaps more quietly. People who knew George continued to believe that his primary emotional and possibly sexual interests were directed toward men, and that his marriage was partly about fulfilling dynastic duty and managing public image. Marina was seen by many as either unaware of this dimension of George's life, or as aware but sophisticated enough to accept it as long as appropriate discretion was maintained. The European aristocracy had a long tradition of marriages that accommodated same-sex relationships as long as heirs were produced and public propriety maintained. George died in 1942 in a plane crash during World War II while on active military service, which meant he died a war hero and was mourned publicly as such. His death at age 39 cut short whatever his later life might have revealed about his relationships and his approach to his royal role. It also meant that the rumours about him remained rumours. There was no later life revelation, no deathbed confession, no archive of private letters that definitively answered questions about his personal life. He became frozen in time as this glamorous, tragic figure whose real story remained tantalizingly unclear. The open secret status of George's sexuality is what makes his case so representative of 20th century royal life. Everyone in fashionable society knew or believed they knew. Journalists knew but couldn't print it. The royal family knew but worked to suppress or manage it. American publications would hint at it in ways that British publications couldn't. But none of this added up to open official acknowledgement. The secret was open in some circles and completely closed in others, and the boundary between those circles was carefully policed by social conventions, legal constraints, and the power of the monarchy to control narratives about its members. What's particularly 20th century about George's story is how it demonstrates the tension between increasing information flow and increasing information management. In earlier centuries, you could hide things by simply not documenting them, or by controlling a small number of chroniclers. In the 20th century, with mass media and global communication, hiding things became much harder. But managing them, creating official narratives that contradicted what everyone unofficially knew, became more sophisticated. George's public image was of a fashionable, glamorous prince who married for love and died a war hero. His private reputation was of a troubled man struggling with sexuality, drugs, and the constraints of royal life. Both versions existed simultaneously in different social spaces, and the 20th century's innovation was developing systems to maintain that parallel existence. Now let's talk about Lord Louis Mountbatten, because if George's story is about open secrets and persistent rumours, Mountbatten's story is about mythology, self-creation, and the question of what we can actually know about someone's private life when they were a master of controlling their public image. Mountbatten was not technically a member of the British royal family by birth. He was born Prince Louis of Battenberg, and his family was German nobility connected to various European royal houses. But he was Queen Victoria's great-grandson, he was extremely close to the British royal family, and he married into it when he wed Edwina Ashley, who was enormously wealthy and well-connected. Mountbatten had one of those sprawling 20th century lives that touched everything. He was a naval officer who rose to become First Sea Lord. He was the last Viceroy of India, overseeing the partition and independence in 1947. He was a mentor and close friend to Prince Philip and Prince Charles. He was assassinated by the IRA in 1979. He was also, according to various sources and rumours that circulated during his life, and exploded after his death, bisexual and involved in numerous affairs with both men and women throughout his long marriage to Edwina. The thing about Mountbatten is that he lived a very public life while apparently maintaining a quite different private life, and he was extremely good at controlling narratives about himself. He was known for being meticulous about his papers and his legacy. He saved everything. He controlled who had access to his archives, and he was very concerned with how history would remember him. This means that the documentary record we have is filtered through Mountbatten's own image management, which makes sorting out truth from self-serving mythology particularly challenging. The rumours about Mountbatten's bisexuality started during his lifetime and became more explicit after his death. Various people claimed to have been his lovers, or to know people who were. Some claimed he had relationships with men in the military during his naval career. Others suggested he and Edwina had an understanding that allowed both of them to pursue relationships outside their marriage. Edwina's affairs with various men, including allegedly with Jawaharlal Nehru, were relatively well documented. The suggestion was that Mountbatten's affairs with men were simply the male equivalent of Edwina's affairs with men, and that their marriage accommodated both of their extramarital interests as long as they were discreet. One of the more persistent rumours concerned Mountbatten's relationship with a young man who was part of his household staff or social circle. The details vary depending on the source. Some accounts suggest a long-term relationship that was an open secret among people close to Mountbatten. Others suggest multiple shorter relationships with different men over the years. The problem is that almost all of this comes from second-hand or third-hand accounts, from people claiming to know things but not always having direct evidence, and from the post-death explosion of rumours when Mountbatten was no longer around to sue for libel or control the narrative. The FBI files on Mountbatten, which were released years after his death, contain allegations about his sexuality based on reports from informants. These files claim he was known to be homosexual or bisexual, and that this was discussed in intelligence circles. But FBI files also contain a lot of unverified gossip and should be treated with appropriate skepticism. Intelligence agencies collect rumours alongside facts, and distinguishing between them in archived files is not always straightforward. What makes Mountbatten's case particularly complicated is that he lived through almost the entire 20th century and operated at the highest levels of British military and political life during periods when homosexuality was illegal and could end careers. If he was having relationships with men, he would have had to be extraordinarily careful and discreet, which means the evidence would be hidden or destroyed. The absence of clear documentary evidence might mean he wasn't having such relationships, or it might mean he was very good at hiding them, which someone with his intelligence background and obsessive control over his papers would certainly have been capable of. The mythology around Mountbatten, that he was this dashing, romantic figure with a glamorous wife and a complicated private life that included relationships with both men and women, is appealing and fits certain patterns we've seen with other royal and aristocratic figures. But separating the mythology from the reality is extremely difficult. Some historians are convinced the rumours are true and point to the pattern of smoke suggesting fire. Others are more sceptical and note that rumours about prominent figures are often wrong and that we should be cautious about accepting them without solid evidence. what we can say with confidence is that Mountbatten moved in circles where same-sex relationships were not uncommon, that he had the sophistication and social position to manage such relationships discreetly if he chose to, that his marriage to Edwina was unconventional and apparently allowed for extramarital relationships, and that rumours about his bisexuality were persistent enough during his life and after his death to become part of his historical reputation. Whether those rumours were based on actual relationships or on misinterpreted closeness with male friends and colleagues, we can't determine definitively from the available evidence. The case of Mountbatten illustrates how 20th century codes of silence worked at the highest levels. If you were sufficiently powerful, sufficiently connected, and sufficiently careful, you could potentially live a private life that was quite different from your public image without facing consequences. The key was discretion, not being caught in compromising situations, not leaving documentary evidence, not allowing scandals to develop that forced official acknowledgement. The system worked as long as everyone who knew things had incentives to stay quiet, which was generally the case for people at Mountbatten's social level. The evolution of codes of silence from the Victorian period to the 20th century shows both continuity and change. The Victorian system was about complete suppression. Scandals were covered up, documents were destroyed, newspapers were threatened. The 20th century system was more about parallel narratives, maintaining an official story while allowing unofficial knowledge to circulate in restricted circles. The official story was for public consumption, for the newspapers, for the record. The unofficial story was for people in the know, and being in the know was itself a marker of social sophistication and insider status. This system created some absurd situations where everyone at a certain social level knew things that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Journalists knew but couldn't print. Aristocrats knew but wouldn't say publicly. Intelligence services knew and filed reports that went into archives where they sat for decades. The people involved knew but maintained deniability. And the general public largely didn't know because the information was carefully controlled and didn't make it into mainstream media coverage. The rise of photography and later film changed how royal images were constructed and disseminated. Now you couldn't just rely on written descriptions that could be carefully worded. You had actual images of royal figures at events, with other people in various contexts. This meant that image management had to become more sophisticated. Controlling who was photographed with whom, what contexts royalty appeared in, how candid moments were handled. For someone like Prince George, being photographed with Noel Coward at parties was fine, as long as the context was presented as fashionable society rather than as anything suggesting improper relationship. The 20th century also saw the development of celebrity culture, which affected royalty in complex ways. Royal figures were increasingly treated as celebrities, with interest in their personal lives, their fashion choices, their relationships. This created more pressure to perform conventional family values, happy marriages, devoted parenthood, respectable private lives. But it also created more opportunities for things to go wrong, for private behaviour to become public scandal, for the gap between image and reality to be exposed. For royal figures who didn't fit conventional moulds, this created new challenges. The old strategies of silence and discretion still worked to some extent, but they required more effort and more coordination as media became more pervasive, and the consequences of failure became more severe. Not just personal disgrace, but potential harm to the institution of monarchy itself, in an era when monarchies were facing new questions about their relevance and legitimacy. The question of what changed and what stayed the same is interesting. The fundamental dynamic of royal figures trying to navigate between personal desire and institutional expectation didn't change. That's been constant across all the centuries we've discussed. But the mechanisms for managing that navigation changed dramatically. In the medieval period, it was about controlling a small number of chroniclers and maintaining plausible deniability through coded language. In the Victorian period, it was about suppression and cover-up when scandals emerged. In the 20th century, it was about sophisticated image management and maintaining parallel narratives for different audiences. What also changed was the gradual shift in social attitudes, though this happened much more slowly and unevenly than we might think. The 20th century saw the beginning of movements for gay rights, challenges to laws criminalizing homosexuality, and slowly increasing acceptance of sexual diversity. But for most of the century, homosexuality remained illegal in Britain. It wasn't until 1967 that it was partially decriminalized for men over 21 in private. This meant that for someone like Prince George, living in the 1920s and 1930s, the legal risks of being openly gay were severe. Even for someone like Mountbatten, operating at the highest levels through the 1950s, 60s and 70s, discretion was absolutely necessary to avoid scandal and potential prosecution. The 20th century created a situation where some people could live relatively openly in certain social circles, the artistic world, fashionable society, certain bohemian neighbourhoods, while still maintaining conventional public images. This created a split between public and private lives that was more pronounced than in earlier periods. You could be known in certain circles as gay or bisexual, while being publicly presented as conventionally married and respectable. The key was maintaining the boundary between those different social worlds, which required constant vigilance and management. For historians trying to understand 20th century royal figures, this creates enormous challenges. We're dealing with people who are actively managing their images and controlling information about themselves. We're dealing with sources that are often unreliable, rumours, gossip, second-hand accounts, posthumous revelations that may be exaggerated or invented. We're dealing with a legal and social environment where people had strong incentives to hide certain aspects of their lives, which means absence of evidence doesn't mean absence of behaviour. And we're dealing with cultural codes and signals that we may not fully understand from our temporal distance. The concept of the open secret that characterised so much of 20th century royal sexuality is particularly frustrating for historical research. How do you prove something that everyone supposedly knew but nobody officially said? How do you evaluate rumours that circulated for decades but never solidified into documentable facts? How do you distinguish between accurate underground knowledge and malicious gossip? These methodological challenges mean that for figures like George and Mountbatten, we can describe the rumours and the patterns, but can't always definitively confirm the details. What we can say is that the 20th century created new possibilities and new constraints for royal figures navigating same-sex desire. The possibilities came from increased social mobility, the existence of underground gay cultures in major cities, and the sophistication of people who understood that public image didn't have to match private reality. The constraints came from continued illegality, the pervasiveness of media scrutiny, and the high stakes of maintaining royal reputation in an era when monarchy's legitimacy was being questioned on multiple fronts. The cases of George and Mountbatten show different strategies for navigating these possibilities and constraints. George seems to have lived more openly within certain social circles while still maintaining public respectability through his marriage and royal duties. His early death meant we never saw how his life might have evolved as social attitudes began to shift. Mountbatten lived much longer and seems to have been even more careful about discretion, maintaining tight control over his image and his archives, which makes his actual private life harder to access, but also suggests he had something to hide, or at least wanted to control how it was revealed. The 20th century also saw the beginning of blackmail as a serious problem for prominent figures with secret same-sex relationships. The combination of illegality, social stigma, and potential career destruction meant that people could be extorted if they had evidence or knowledge that someone was gay. This created a climate of fear and vulnerability that reinforced the need for absolute discretion. For royal figures, the stakes were even higher because blackmail could potentially affect not just individuals, but the institution of monarchy itself. The intelligence services were aware of this vulnerability and apparently kept files on prominent figures who might be blackmail risks. The files on Mountbatten that mentioned his sexuality were partly about this concern, not necessarily about moral judgment, but about security risk. If foreign intelligence agencies knew or suspected things about a senior British military and political figure, that created potential vulnerabilities that British intelligence needed to be aware of. This meant that people's private lives became matters of state security, which added another layer of surveillance and control. By the end of the 20th century, the system of open secrets and parallel narratives was beginning to break down, partly because social attitudes were changing, and partly because media was becoming harder to control. The tabloid press became more aggressive about pursuing royal stories. People who in earlier eras would have kept quiet were more willing to sell stories. The deference that had characterized royal coverage for most of the century was eroding. This meant that maintaining the old codes of silence was becoming harder and would become nearly impossible in the 21st century, but that's a story for the next chapter. What the 20th century shows us is that modernization didn't eliminate the need for discretion and image management around royal sexuality. If anything, it made those things more complex and more necessary. The old strategies had to be updated for new media environments, but the basic dynamic of protecting royal reputation while managing private reality continued, and for the individuals involved, The gap between who they could be publicly and who they were privately remained painfully wide for most of the century, even as underground communities developed and social attitudes slowly began to shift. The codes of silence evolved, but they didn't disappear, and for royal figures the constraint of maintaining appropriate public images while living authentic private lives remained as difficult in the 20th century as it had been in earlier periods. After centuries of coded language, strategic silence, open secrets, and elaborate image management, we arrive at something genuinely new, someone actually just saying it out loud. In 2018, Lord Ivar Mountbatten became the first member of the extended British royal family to enter into a same-sex marriage openly, publicly, and without apology. He married James Coyle in what was described as a joyful ceremony at his family chapel, with his ex-wife giving him away because apparently the 21st century decided to skip past several steps of awkwardness and go straight to, "We're all adults here, and we can make this work." The wedding was covered in mainstream media, photographed, discussed, and generally treated as a milestone moment, which it absolutely was. But what makes it particularly striking is understanding just how long the journey was to get to that point. Let's be clear about who Ivar Mountbatten is, because the degree of connection to the royal family matters for understanding the significance. He's not a prince. He's not in the line of succession. He's a cousin of the late Prince Philip, which makes him a second cousin once removed of King Charles III, which is about as extended family as you can get while still technically being family. In the grand hierarchy of royalty, he's far enough removed that his personal life doesn't directly affect the succession or the core functioning of the monarchy. This is important because it helps explain why he could do something that would have been unthinkable for someone closer to the throne, even in 2018. But he's also connected enough that he carries a title, Lord Ivar Mountbatten, and moves in royal and aristocratic circles. His family, the Mountbattens, are deeply woven into 20th century royal history. His grandfather was the Marquis of Milford Haven. His great-uncle was Lord Louis Mountbatten, the same Mountbatten we discussed in the previous chapter with all the rumours and mythology around his own sexuality. So Ivar grew up in a family where the management of public image and private reality was not just understood but was practically a family tradition. The irony of a Mountbatten being the one to break the pattern of discretion and secrecy is not lost on anyone who knows the family history. Ivar was born in 1963, which means he came of age in the 1980s, during the AIDS crisis, during Section 28 in Britain that prohibited promoting homosexuality in schools, during a period of intense social panic about gay people. He married Penelope Thompson in 1994, and they had 3 daughters together. By all external appearances, he was living a conventional aristocratic life: marriage, children, country estate, fulfilling the expectations that came with his title and his position. But internally he was struggling with the fact that he was gay and had been his entire life. The timeline of Ivar's coming out is instructive. He and Penelope separated in 2010, and he came out to his family around the same time. This was a private coming out, telling the people closest to him, beginning to live more authentically in his personal life, but not making any public statements or drawing media attention. For the next several years, he lived what we might call a semi-open life. People in his social circles knew he was gay. He was in a relationship with James Coyle, who is a former airline steward and not from aristocratic background. But this wasn't public knowledge in the way we think of public knowledge in the social media age. It wasn't until 2016 that Ivar gave his first media interview about being gay, speaking to a British newspaper about his experience of coming out later in life, his divorce, his relationship with James, and how his daughters and ex-wife had been supportive. The interview was pitched as a story about middle-aged coming out, about the challenges of living a closeted life, and about how things were changing such that even aristocrats could now be open about their sexuality. The response was largely positive, which tells you something about how much social attitudes had shifted since the 1980s, when Ivar was young and felt he couldn't be open. The 2018 wedding was the culmination of this gradual process of coming out. It was a relatively small ceremony, about 60 guests, held at the private chapel on the Devon estate where Ivar's family has lived for generations. His ex-wife Penny walked him down the aisle, which became one of the most commented upon aspects of the whole event. The media loved this detail because it challenged the narrative of bitter divorce and suggested a modern, evolved approach to family restructuring. Penny later gave interviews saying she wanted to support Ivar on his special day, that she was happy he could finally be himself, and that maintaining a positive co-parenting relationship was more important than nursing grievances about the past. The wedding photos show Eva and James looking genuinely happy, surrounded by family and friends, no elaborate royal protocol, just a couple getting married in a meaningful setting with people they loved. The coverage in British media was overwhelmingly positive. Here was a member of the aristocracy, connected to the royal family, being openly gay and married, and the sky had not fallen. There were no protests, no scandal, no public denunciations from family members. It was treated as a nice wedding story with the added interest of the royal connection and the historical significance of being a first. What's remarkable about this, when you hold it against the history we've discussed in previous chapters, is how unremarkable it was allowed to be. Think about all the kings and princes we've talked about who lived in fear of exposure, who had to code their relationships in letters, who faced political ruin or worse if their same-sex attachments became too public. Think about Prince George, Duke of Kent, with all those persistent rumours that could never be officially acknowledged. Think about the Cleveland Street scandal and the extensive cover-up to protect Prince Albert Victor. Think about centuries of strategic silence and parallel narratives. And then here's Ivar Mountbatten, giving newspaper interviews about being gay, posting wedding photos, appearing on morning television shows, and generally treating his sexuality and his marriage as things that can be discussed openly without catastrophic consequences. The contrast is staggering. What changed? How did we get from Edward the Sioux having to watch his favourite executed by nobles who were offended by their relationship, to Ivar Mountbatten getting congratulatory messages from family members and positive press coverage? Part of what changed is obvious. Legal and social attitudes toward homosexuality transformed dramatically over the 20th and early 21st centuries. Homosexuality was decriminalised in Britain in stages starting in 1967. The AIDS crisis paradoxically helped, in the long run, by forcing public conversation about gay people and creating activism around gay rights. Civil partnerships became legal in 2004. Same-sex marriage became legal in England and Wales in 2013, in Scotland in 2014. By 2018, a same-sex wedding was not just legal, but was becoming socially normalised, at least in urban and progressive circles. But the legal changes don't fully explain the shift in royal and aristocratic contexts. After all, same-sex marriage being legal doesn't automatically mean that tradition-bound institutions embrace it. The royal family and the aristocracy have often been more conservative than the general public, more invested in maintaining traditional structures and appearances. The fact that Ivar could be openly gay and openly married, and that this was accepted and even celebrated within his family and social circles, suggests something deeper had shifted about how the upper classes thought about sexuality and family. Part of this shift was generational. By 2018, the people who held power and influence in aristocratic families were often from generations that had grown up with more exposure to gay rights movements, more openness about sexuality, more awareness that being gay was not a moral failing or a shameful secret. Ivar's daughters, born in the 1990s and 2000s, grew up in a world where having a gay parent was challenging but not impossible, where they could find support and resources, where they didn't have to pretend their father was something he wasn't. The shift was also about the reduced stakes of royal reputation. In earlier centuries, royal sexuality mattered because it was tied to succession, to political alliances, to the divine right of kings, to the moral authority of the monarchy. A king having male favourites could be used against him politically, could undermine his authority, could create succession crises if he failed to produce heirs. By 2018, the British monarchy was constitutional, its political power largely symbolic, and extended family members like Ivar were even more peripheral. His sexuality didn't affect who would be king, didn't create diplomatic problems, didn't threaten the institution's functioning. This made it much easier for the family to be supportive or at least quietly accepting. There's also the factor of media management evolving again. In the 20th century, as we discussed, the strategy was maintaining parallel narratives, official stories for public consumption, and unofficial knowledge that circulated in restricted circles. By the 21st century, with social media and the internet, this became nearly impossible to sustain. Information leaked, people talked, maintaining secrets required exhausting effort. The new strategy became controlling the narrative by getting ahead of it, coming out on your own terms, telling your own story, rather than waiting for it to be exposed or speculated about. Ivar's approach of gradually coming out, first to family, then in social circles, then in a newspaper interview, then with the wedding, was a masterclass in modern image management. He controlled the narrative at each step. He framed his story in sympathetic terms, and by the time the wedding happened, It felt like a natural progression rather than a shocking revelation. This is very different from the old strategy of maintaining absolute secrecy until exposure forced a crisis. The new approach acknowledges that secrets are hard to keep in the digital age, and that being proactive about disclosure can actually protect you better than attempting total suppression. The role of his ex-wife Penny in all of this is also significant and worth examining. The fact that she not only supported his coming out but actively participated in his wedding, giving him away and appearing in the media coverage, reframed what could have been a story about a failed marriage into a story about evolved, mature adults supporting each other. This helped make Ivar's story sympathetic and relatable. It wasn't about deception or betrayal. It was about a man who married before he fully understood or could accept his own sexuality, who eventually came to terms with who he was, and who managed to maintain a positive relationship with his ex-wife and daughters through the transition. This narrative of coming out later in life was particularly important because it resonated with a lot of people who had lived closeted lives due to social pressure, family expectations, or internalized homophobia. Ivar's story became, in some ways, representative of a broader experience of people who came of age before social acceptance, and who only found the courage or freedom to come out as adults after living conventional lives for years or decades. The fact that he was aristocracy made the story more interesting to media, but the underlying themes were universal. The contrast with his great-uncle Louis Mountbatten is particularly striking. Louis, as we discussed, lived his entire life managing rumours, maintaining image control, never officially acknowledging anything about his private life beyond his marriage to Edwina. He died with the rumours still rumours, never confirmed or denied. Ivar, 2 generations later, was able to simply be open, to marry the person he loved, to have that marriage recognised legally and socially. The shift happened within a single family across just a few generations, which gives you a sense of how rapid the social change was. But we should also be clear about the limits of what Ivar's story represents. He was able to be open partly because of his position, far enough from the throne that it didn't matter politically, privileged enough that he had resources and support, connected enough that media treated him respectfully rather than as tabloid fodder. Someone in a different position might not have had the same freedom. Even in 2018, there were still royal family members who were not publicly out, who presumably were navigating their own closets or semi-closeted lives, who had not been able to take the step that Ivar took. The question of who else in the extended royal family might be LGBTQ+ is one that comes up, but that's difficult to address without engaging in the same kind of speculation and rumour-mongering that characterise so much of the history we've discussed. What we can say is that statistically, in a family as large and extended as the British royal family and aristocracy, there are certainly other LGBTQ+ people. Some may be out in their private lives but not publicly. Some may still be closeted. Some may be in the process of coming out. Ivar being the first to have a public same-sex wedding doesn't mean he's the only LGBTQ+ person in the extended family. It means he was the first in a position where he felt able and willing to be that public about it. The symbolic significance of Ivar's wedding extends beyond just his personal story. It represented an endpoint of sorts to the centuries of secrecy, coding, and strategic silence that we've traced through this entire exploration. Here, finally, was a member of the royal extended family who didn't have to code anything, didn't have to maintain parallel narratives, didn't have to live in fear of exposure or scandal. He could just be himself, openly, and the institution of monarchy, or at least its extended periphery, could accommodate that without crisis. This doesn't mean the struggle is over or that everything is resolved. The Church of England, of which the British monarch is the supreme governor, still doesn't allow same-sex marriages to be performed in its churches, though it has moved toward allowing blessings. This means that while Ivar could have a legal same-sex marriage, there are still institutional constraints within the church that the royal family is tied to. For someone closer to the throne, someone whose wedding would need to be in a Church of England cathedral with all the formal protocols, the path would be more complicated than it was for Ivar in his family chapel. The issue of succession and heirs also remains relevant. While same-sex couples can adopt or use surrogacy to have children, and those children are legally recognised, there are still complex questions about how this intersects with royal succession rules and titles. For someone in the direct line of succession, being openly gay and having a same-sex partner and children through alternative means would raise questions that haven't yet been tested. Ivar, being outside the succession, didn't have to navigate these complexities, but they exist for others who are more central. The international dimension also matters. The British royal family has connections to many Commonwealth countries, some of which have very different attitudes toward homosexuality. Some Commonwealth nations still criminalize same-sex relationships. The monarch's role as head of the Commonwealth creates diplomatic complexities around LGBTQ+ issues that don't have easy solutions. A senior royal being openly gay could create tensions with some Commonwealth nations while being celebrated in others. These are the kinds of practical political considerations that still shape what's possible within the institution. What Ivar's story demonstrates is that change is possible and that institutions can evolve, but also that change often happens at the margins first before moving to the centre. Ivar could be openly gay partly because he was marginal, important enough to be newsworthy, connected enough to be considered royal family, but not central enough that his sexuality affected the functioning of the monarchy. Whether that openness can extend to more central figures remains an open question that will likely be answered by future generations. The historical parallel that strikes me most strongly is thinking about all those earlier figures, the medieval kings, the Stuart favourites, the Victorian scandals, the 20th century open secrets, and wondering what they would think about Ivar's wedding. Would Edward VI have been envious that someone could openly marry their male partner? Would James I, who wrote those passionate letters to his favourites, have understood Ivar's ability to be open as freedom, or would he have seen it as a different kind of constraint, a requirement to publicly label and categorise something that James preferred to keep ambiguous? Would Prince George, Duke of Kent, who died in 1942 with his sexuality still a matter of rumour and speculation, have wanted the kind of openness that Ivar achieved? Or would he have preferred the system of parallel narratives where sophisticated people knew, but it wasn't discussed publicly? These counterfactual questions are impossible to answer, but they remind us that different historical moments create different possibilities and different constraints. What feels like liberation in one context might feel like exposure or unwanted attention in another. What's undeniable is that Ivar's wedding represented something genuinely new in the long history of same-sex relationships in British royalty and aristocracy. Not just a rumour, not just coded language, not just an open secret, but an actual legal, publicly celebrated same-sex marriage with photos and interviews and congratulations. It was a moment of visibility that would have been unthinkable in previous generations, and that visibility matters both for its symbolic significance and for its practical effects in normalising LGBTQ+ relationships within traditional institutions. The reactions from the broader LGBTQ+ community in Britain were generally positive but also nuanced. Some celebrated Ivar as a pioneer, someone who used his privilege and position to advance visibility and acceptance. Others noted that while his story was nice, it was also the story of a wealthy, white, aristocratic man who came out in his 50s after living a conventional, privileged life for decades. The question of whose stories get celebrated and whose don't, whose coming out is treated as newsworthy and whose isn't, remained relevant even in celebrating this milestone. There was also discussion about whether Ivar's relative marginality within the royal family made his openness less meaningful. If being out was only possible for extended family members far from the throne, did that really represent progress for the institution as a whole? Or was this a necessary first step with more central figures potentially following later? These debates reflect the complexity of institutional change, which rarely happens all at once but instead proceeds through incremental steps, each one enabling the next. The media coverage of Ivar's story also revealed some of the continuing tensions and contradictions. While most coverage was positive, there was still an element of treating his sexuality as unusual or remarkable, as something that needed explanation or context. The framing was often, despite being aristocracy, he's gay, or he's gay but he's handling it well, which implies that being gay is still seen as somewhat exceptional or problematic, even when it's being celebrated. True normalization would be when someone's same-sex wedding is covered the same way any other society wedding is covered, without the sexuality being the story itself. That said, the fact that Ivar's wedding was covered extensively and positively in mainstream media, not just in LGBTQ+ publications, did represent progress. The photos appeared in major newspapers and magazines. The story was discussed on morning television shows. It entered the broader cultural conversation in ways that earlier generation stories never could have. This visibility created representation that mattered for LGBTQ+ people who saw themselves reflected in this story, and it contributed to broader social acceptance by normalizing same-sex relationships in aristocratic and royal contexts. The involvement of Ivar's daughters in the wedding and the public narrative was also significant. They spoke about having a gay father, about the adjustment process, about ultimately being supportive and happy for him. This provided a model for families navigating similar situations, showing that children could accept and support a parent's coming out even when it meant significant changes to their family structure. The visible support from the next generation suggested that the future would be even more accepting than the present. Looking at Ivar's story in the context of the entire history we've traced, from medieval kings to 20th century open secrets, what's most striking is both how much changed and what remained constant. What changed is everything about the legal status, social acceptance, ability to be open, and freedom from the worst consequences of exposure. Ivar could be openly gay, legally married, and publicly visible in ways that would have been literally impossible for anyone we discussed in earlier chapters. The transformation in just a few generations is remarkable. What remained constant is the fundamental human desire to love who you love and to be yourself authentically. That's been true across all the centuries, all the different social contexts, all the varying systems of constraint and control. Whether it was a medieval king writing passionate letters to his favourite, a Stuart prince giving speeches defending his right to love another man, a Victorian prince rumoured to visit male brothels, or a 20th century extended royal family member gradually coming out over several years, the underlying human experience of same-sex attraction and the desire for authentic relationships persisted across all contexts. The difference is that Ivar got to live his truth openly in a way that earlier generations couldn't. He got to marry the person he loved in a ceremony recognised by law and celebrated by family. He got to have his relationship treated as valid and meaningful rather than as a scandal to be suppressed or an open secret to be carefully managed. That's progress, real and meaningful, even if it's incomplete and even if many challenges remain. The symbolism of his wedding taking place in the family chapel is worth noting. This wasn't a registry office ceremony tucked away from view. This was a religious ceremony in a space that represented generations of family history, with his ancestors literally buried beneath the floor. The chapel had witnessed centuries of conventional aristocratic marriages, and now it witnessed a same-sex marriage, and the building didn't collapse and the family didn't disown him, and society didn't fall apart. The ceremony in that space represented continuity as much as change. Ivar was claiming his place in his family's history, asserting that his relationship and his marriage were part of that lineage, not separate from it. This connects back to something we've seen throughout this entire history: the tension between institutional tradition and individual authenticity. Institutions like monarchy and aristocracy are built on tradition, on maintaining continuity with the past, on preserving structures and hierarchies across generations. But they're also made up of individual human beings who have their own desires, identities, and need for authentic self-expression. The history of same-sex relationships in British royalty is partly about how that tension has been navigated across different periods, sometimes through silence, sometimes through coded language, sometimes through parallel narratives, and now, finally, through at least some degree of openness. Ivar's ability to navigate that tension successfully, to be both authentically himself and to maintain his place in his family and social world, suggests that these institutions are more flexible and adaptable than they sometimes appear. They can evolve to accommodate people who don't fit traditional molds, though that evolution is often slow and incomplete and requires people willing to push boundaries and take risks. Ivar took a risk by being open, even though by 2018 the risk was much smaller than it would have been in earlier periods. His willingness to be visible, to tell his story, to have his wedding covered in media, contributed to the ongoing evolution of how the institution handles LGBTQ+ members. The fact that we can now tell this story openly, that Ivar's marriage is public record and celebrated rather than hidden or coded, represents a kind of historical justice for all those earlier figures whose stories we could only reconstruct through rumours, hints, and careful reading of sources. They lived in times when openness wasn't possible, when being discovered could mean disgrace, exile, imprisonment, or death. They found ways to love and to create relationships despite the constraints, but they couldn't be open about it. Ivar's ability to be open, to be legally married, to be himself publicly, is a kind of vindication of all those earlier struggles and a reminder of how far we've come. But we should end this chapter by acknowledging that the story isn't finished. Ivar's wedding was a milestone, but it wasn't an endpoint. There are still questions about what full inclusion of LGBTQ+ people in the royal family would look like, especially for those closer to the throne. There are still institutional barriers within the Church of England and within Commonwealth structures. There are still social attitudes that need to continue evolving. The journey from coded medieval chronicles to open 21st century marriages is remarkable, but it's not complete, and future generations will continue writing chapters in this ongoing story of how institutions adapt to include all their members authentically. So here we are, at the end of this journey through centuries of British royal history, having traced a thread that connects Edward II's passionate letters to Piers Gaveston all the way to Lord Ivar Mountbatten's wedding photos posted on social media. It's been quite a trip, hasn't it? From medieval chroniclers carefully coding their observations about kings who loved their favourites beyond measure, through Victorian cover-ups of male brothel scandals, to 20th century open secrets that everyone knew but nobody said, and finally to the 21st century where at least some people can just be open about who they are. The landscape has changed dramatically, and yet when you step back and look at the patterns that emerge across all these centuries, some things have remained remarkably consistent. The first pattern that emerges clearly is how favouritism became a political weapon, regardless of whether there was anything sexual about the relationships. This is important because it tells us that the problem wasn't always or even primarily about the nature of the relationships themselves. It was about power. When a king elevated a single person to a position of extraordinary influence, gave them wealth and titles that others thought they deserved, and made that person the gateway to royal favour, it created resentment and political instability. Whether the king was sleeping with the favourite or just deeply emotionally attached to them, or even just found them politically useful, the result was the same. Other nobles felt excluded. Power became concentrated in ways that violated norms of distributed authority, and political opposition developed. Look at Edward II and Gaveston, or Edward III and Despenser. Yes, the relationships were probably sexual or romantic, and yes, contemporary chroniclers hinted at that. But what actually got Gaveston killed and contributed to Edward's eventual deposition wasn't that he was the king's lover. It was that he had accumulated so much power and wealth that the nobility couldn't tolerate it anymore. The personal relationship enabled the political favouritism, but it was the political consequences that created the crisis. Similarly with Richard II and Robert de Vere, the intimacy of their relationship was noted and criticised. But what actually threatened Richard's reign was that de Vere's influence was seen as corrupting royal governance. This pattern continued through the Stuart period. James III's relationships with Robert Carr and George Villiers were clearly emotionally and possibly sexually intimate. But what created political problems was the power these favourites wielded. Parliament didn't try to impeach Buckingham because he was the king's lover. They tried to impeach him because his policies were failing, and his influence over both James and Charles was seen as harmful to the realm. The personal relationship and the political power were intertwined, but the political dimension was what made it a constitutional crisis rather than just a personal scandal. What this tells us is that accusations about same-sex relationships were often deployed instrumentally, as part of broader political attacks. If a king was governing well and keeping his nobles happy, his personal relationships might be tolerated or at least not actively opposed, even if they were known to be outside conventional norms. But if a king was failing politically, if his favourites were incompetent or corrupt, if power was being abused, then suddenly his personal relationships became fair game for attack and criticism. The sexuality was weaponized as part of broader political conflict. This leads to the second pattern, how gender and sexuality accusations were used to discredit rulers who were unpopular or threatening for other reasons. The medieval chroniclers who wrote about William Rufus having a court full of effeminate sodomites weren't primarily concerned with documenting sexual behaviour. They were painting a picture of a bad king who had rejected proper Christian order. The accusations about sexual deviance were part of a package of charges meant to demonstrate that William deserved his violent death in the forest. The term unnatural carried such rhetorical weight precisely because it connected personal behaviour to cosmic order. A king who engaged in unnatural acts was rebelling against God's design for creation, placing himself outside the divine order that supposedly legitimised his rule. This made accusations of unnaturalness devastating when they could be made to stick, but it also meant they were deployed selectively against kings who had already made powerful enemies. Not every king who had male favourites got called unnatural, just the ones who were failing in other ways or who had antagonised the wrong people. This pattern of using sexuality accusations as political weapons continued into later periods, just with different language. The Victorian period couldn't use unnatural in quite the same theological sense, but they could use medical language about perversion and degeneracy, or moral language about vice and corruption. Prince Albert Victor may or may not have visited the Cleveland Street brothel, but the rumours were useful for people who wanted to undermine him, or to demonstrate the moral bankruptcy of the aristocracy. The accusations did political work regardless of their truth value. Even in the 20th century, this pattern persisted. The rumours about Prince George, Duke of Kent, or Lord Louis Mountbatten weren't just idle gossip. They were part of how reputations were constructed and how influence was managed. In the intelligence world, keeping files on people's sexuality was explicitly about identifying potential vulnerabilities and pressure points. The personal was always political when it came to powerful people, and sexuality was always a potential weapon to be deployed when useful. The third major pattern is the code of silence as a survival strategy. This evolved over time but was present in every period we've discussed. In the medieval period, it took the form of chroniclers using coded language and biblical allusions that knowledgeable readers could interpret, but that maintained plausible deniability. In the Stuart period, it was the careful management of letters and documents, the understanding that certain things could be said in private but not in public. In the Victorian period, it became elaborate cover-ups and suppressions when scandals threatened to expose uncomfortable truths. In the 20th century, it was the system of open secrets where sophisticated people knew things that couldn't be officially acknowledged. What united all these different manifestations was the understanding that silence or discretion was necessary for survival, both for individuals and for the institution of monarchy. Kings who wanted to have relationships with male favourites needed to maintain some level of discretion or risk political consequences. Chroniclers who wanted to document unusual relationships without being accused of libel or sacrilege needed to code their language carefully. Victorian families needed to suppress scandals to maintain the appearance of moral respectability that the era demanded. 20th century royal figures needed to maintain parallel narratives because media scrutiny made complete hiding impossible, but social attitudes still punished openness. The code of silence was maintained through multiple mechanisms. Legal threats and libel laws prevented explicit publication of accusations. Social norms about discretion meant that people who knew things often chose not to speak publicly. Family and institutional loyalties meant that protecting the institution took precedence over truth-telling. Economic incentives meant that people dependent on royal patronage had reasons to keep quiet. And the shame and stigma attached to same-sex desire meant that the people most directly involved often wanted silence as much or more than the institution did. What's striking is how much effort went into maintaining these codes of silence across centuries. The suppression of the Cleveland Street scandal required coordination between government, police, press, and aristocratic families. The management of 20th century open secrets required constant vigilance and image control. The cost in human terms, people unable to be themselves, living in fear of exposure, constructing false public identities, experiencing the stress of maintaining double lives, was enormous. And the cost in historical terms was the loss of truth, the distortion of records, the creation of gaps in historical knowledge that we're still trying to fill. The patterns of how same-sex relationships were described and understood also evolved in interesting ways. Medieval chroniclers used language about excessive love and immoderate attachment, framing the problem as one of balance and measure rather than identity. The relationships were sinful because they were disordered, not because the people involved were a different type of human being. Stuart-era writers began to develop more language about particular individuals having particular inclinations, though still without the modern framework of sexual orientation. Victorian sexology created the category of the homosexual as a type of person with a particular psychology, which changed how these relationships were understood. Now they were about identity rather than just acts. This evolution in understanding created both new possibilities and new constraints. Once there was a category of homosexual identity, people could recognize themselves in that category and find communities of others like them. But that same categorization also enabled new forms of medical pathologization, legal persecution, and social stigma. The creation of identity categories was a double-edged sword, and we see that playing out in how 20th century royal figures navigated their lives. On one hand, they could potentially understand themselves through these new frameworks, but on the other hand, those frameworks made them more vulnerable to exposure and judgment. What changed most dramatically across the centuries we've examined was the legal status and social acceptance of same-sex relationships. Medieval sodomy laws were on the books but irregularly enforced, and prosecution usually required political motivation beyond just the acts themselves. By the Victorian period, the law had become more comprehensive and enforcement more systematic, creating real legal jeopardy for men engaged in same-sex acts. The 20th century saw the continuation of legal prohibition until partial decriminalization in 1967, and full legal equality including marriage rights didn't arrive until the 21st century. This legal evolution shaped everything about how same-sex relationships could exist and be expressed. When acts were illegal and prosecution was a real possibility, discretion wasn't just advisable, it was necessary for avoiding prison. When social stigma was intense and could destroy careers and families, staying closeted was a survival strategy, not just a personal preference. The gradual relaxation of legal prohibitions and social stigma across the late 20th and early 21st centuries created new possibilities for openness that simply hadn't existed before. But what remained constant, and this is perhaps the most important observation, is that people across all these centuries experienced same-sex desire and formed same-sex relationships despite whatever constraints their societies imposed. The desire itself, the human capacity for attraction and love that doesn't follow conventional patterns, has been consistent across time. What changed was how that desire could be expressed, how relationships could be structured, what language was available to describe experiences, and what consequences people faced for being who they were. This is why the history matters. Not just as a catalogue of who was or wasn't gay across British royal history, that's interesting but ultimately limited. What matters is understanding how people navigated impossible situations, how they found ways to love and to live authentically despite constraints, how they built relationships and communities even when those had to be hidden or coded. Their strategies and struggles inform our understanding of human resilience and the persistence of desire across historical contexts that tried to suppress or eliminate it. The gaps in the historical record are themselves telling. For every king or prince whose same-sex relationships are documented, how many others left no trace? For every chronicler who carefully coded their observations, how many simply chose not to write anything at all about aspects of royal life they witnessed? For every letter that survived, how many were destroyed? The silence in the archives is as significant as what's preserved, because it reminds us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when there were powerful reasons to destroy evidence. This means that the 25 figures we've discussed in this series are almost certainly not the complete list of British royals who experienced same-sex desire or had same-sex relationships. They're just the ones whose stories left enough traces for us to reconstruct something of their experiences. The actual number is probably much higher, but their stories are lost to history because the codes of silence worked, because evidence was destroyed, because chroniclers chose discretion, because the individuals themselves successfully hid their relationships, or because they lived in periods or positions where their personal lives simply weren't documented in ways that survived. So how many stories remain untold? We can't know precisely, but we can be confident the answer is many. Every gap in documentation, every destroyed letter collection, every chronicle that's suspiciously silent about aspects of a king's personal life, potentially represents stories that will never recover. The history we've traced is incomplete by necessity, limited by what evidence survived centuries of suppression, loss, and deliberate destruction. What we have are fragments, hints, patterns, enough to reconstruct outlines but rarely enough to fully understand the lived experience of the people involved. This should make us appropriately humble about historical claims. When we say a particular king was or wasn't gay, or that a relationship was or wasn't sexual, we're often working from limited evidence filtered through multiple layers of agenda and interpretation. The medieval chronicler who wrote about immoderate love had his own perspective and reasons for describing it that way. The Victorian editor who translated medieval Latin made choices about English equivalents that reflected Victorian assumptions. The 20th century historian who interpreted those sources brought their own frameworks and biases. And we, reading in the 21st century, bring our own assumptions about sexuality, identity, and relationships. The most honest approach is to present what evidence exists, acknowledge its limitations, discuss the range of possible interpretations, and be clear about what we can and can't know. Some cases are clearer than others. James III's letters to his favourites are pretty explicitly intimate, and his public defence of those relationships shows they were significant beyond just political alliance. Other cases are much more ambiguous. Did Richard the Lionheart have a romantic relationship with Philip of France? Or were they just politically allied young men in a culture that celebrated intense male friendship? The sources allow multiple interpretations and historians disagree. What we can trace with more confidence are the patterns of how power, gender and sexuality intersected across British royal history. The way favouritism worked politically. The way accusations about effeminacy or unnaturalness were deployed as weapons. The way codes of silence evolved to protect both individuals and institutions. The way social and legal contexts shaped what was possible and what was dangerous. These patterns are visible even when individual cases remain ambiguous, and they tell us important things about how monarchy and sexuality interacted across centuries. Looking at the journey from medieval codes to modern openness, what's most striking is how recent the change has been. For roughly 800 years of the history we've covered, from the medieval period through most of the 20th century, the pattern was consistent. Silence, discretion, coding, suppression when necessary. Then, in just the last few decades, that pattern was disrupted. Legal changes, social movements, generational shifts, and the courage of individuals who chose to be open created new possibilities that simply hadn't existed before. Lord Ivar Mountbatten's 2018 wedding represents a discontinuity with most of the history we've discussed. For the first time, a member of the royal family could be openly gay, legally married, and publicly celebrated without scandal or suppression. That's genuinely new, and it's important to recognize how significant that change is. But it's also important to recognize how recent and incomplete that change remains. Ivar could be open partly because of his marginal position. Closer to the throne, the constraints might be different. In other countries and contexts, the old patterns of silence and suppression continue. The question of what comes next is fascinating. Will the openness that Ivar represents extend to more central royal figures? Will we see a direct heir to the throne who is openly LGBTQ+? How will traditional institutions like the monarchy and the Church of England continue to evolve on these questions? These are questions that future generations will answer, and their answers will add new chapters to the history we've traced. The story isn't over. We're living through a period of transition where old patterns are breaking down but new ones haven't fully solidified. What this history teaches us, beyond the specific stories of individual kings and princes, is something about the relationship between institutions and human authenticity. Monarchy is perhaps the most tradition-bound, continuity-focused institution in British society. It's literally about passing power through family lines, maintaining connections to the past, preserving structures that are centuries old. And yet even monarchy has had to adapt, however slowly and incompletely, to include people who don't fit its traditional molds. The tension between institutional continuity and individual authenticity is never fully resolved, but the history shows that adaptation is possible, that institutions can evolve without losing their essential character. It also teaches us about the power of visibility and representation. For centuries, LGBTQ+ royals were invisible, hidden by silence, coded in language that obscured as much as it revealed, or reduced to rumours and speculation. That invisibility reinforced the idea that such people didn't exist or were aberrations. The gradual increase in visibility, even when it took the form of open secrets or posthumous revelations, began to change that narrative. And now, with figures like Ivar who can be completely open, there's visible proof that LGBTQ+ people have always been part of these institutions and these families, not outside them or opposed to them. This visibility matters for LGBTQ+ young people, who might see themselves reflected in these stories, who might understand that their identities are not incompatible with tradition, family, or institutional belonging. It matters for changing social attitudes more broadly, as seeing people from respected institutions being open helps normalize LGBTQ+ identities, and it matters historically, as proper acknowledgement and documentation of these relationships and identities in the present creates the archive that future historians will use, preventing the gaps and silences that have made reconstructing the past so challenging. The patterns we've traced, favoritism as political weapon, accusations as means of discrediting, silence as survival strategy, these aren't just historical curiosities. They're patterns that persist in different forms in contemporary politics and society. People in power still face intense scrutiny of their personal lives. Personal relationships still get weaponized in political conflicts. Marginalized identities still require strategies for navigation and survival, even in relatively accepting contexts. Understanding the historical patterns helps us recognize their contemporary manifestations and resist their worst effects. As we close this exploration, it's worth reflecting on what we've learned and what remains unknown. We've learned that same-sex desire and relationships have existed across all periods of British royal history, that they've been expressed in many different ways depending on social context, that they've been documented through coded language and hints when explicit documentation was too dangerous, and that they've shaped political history in ways that often went unacknowledged in official narratives. We've learned about the enormous human cost of suppression and the courage it took to maintain authentic relationships despite that suppression. What remains unknown is vast. How many royal figures lived their entire lives closeted, leaving no trace for historians to find? How many relationships existed that we'll never know about because all evidence was successfully destroyed? How many people might have explored same-sex attraction but didn't because the constraints were too severe? What were the interior lives of these people like? The fear, the joy, the conflict between duty and desire? How did they understand themselves in terms that their cultures provided or didn't provide? These unknowns remind us that history is always partial and incomplete. We work with what survived. We make inferences from patterns. We acknowledge ambiguity when certainty isn't possible. The stories we've told in this series are reconstructions based on available evidence, interpreted through frameworks that we're conscious of but that inevitably shape our understanding. Future historians with different frameworks and possibly different evidence might tell these stories differently, and that's appropriate. History is an ongoing conversation, not a fixed set of facts. What we can say with confidence is that the journey from medieval silence to modern openness has been long, uneven, and incomplete, but it has happened. The old codes of silence that protected institutions and individuals through strategic discretion have largely broken down, at least in some contexts. The weaponization of sexuality accusations continues but faces more pushback. The possibility of living openly exists for at least some people in ways it never did before. The patterns have shifted, even if they haven't disappeared. And perhaps most importantly, we can say that through all the centuries of constraint and suppression, people persisted in being themselves and loving whom they loved. The medieval kings who wrote passionate letters despite knowing what chroniclers might make of them. The Stuart favourites who accepted royal affection knowing it made them targets for political enemies. The Victorian princes who navigated underground worlds while maintaining respectable public faces. The 20th century figures who lived as open secrets known but not spoken. And the 21st century individuals who finally stepped fully into visibility. Their persistence across impossible circumstances is the real story here. Not just who was or wasn't gay, but how people maintained their humanity and their capacity for love despite systems designed to suppress both. That's what makes this history worth studying and worth preserving. Not as a catalogue of historical figures' sexualities, but as a record of human resilience, the endurance of desire, and the slow, difficult progress towards societies where people can be fully themselves. So as we end this journey through 8 centuries of British royal history, from coded medieval chronicles to Instagram wedding photos, from favourites executed for loving the wrong king to legal marriages celebrated by families, we're left with both the satisfaction of understanding patterns and the humility of recognising how much remains unknown. The stories we've told matter, but so do all the untold stories that exist in the silences, the gaps, the carefully destroyed evidence, and the lives lived so discreetly that they left no historical trace. Those untold stories are out there somewhere, in archives not yet examined, in chronicles not yet fully decoded, in patterns not yet recognised, and in lives that found ways to exist authentically despite leaving no documentation for us to find. The history we've traced is real and important, but it's also incomplete, and that incompleteness is itself part of the story. It reminds us that silence and suppression leave lasting marks, that the gaps in our knowledge represent real human lives and experiences that will never fully recover, and that every person who can now be open stands in some way for all those who couldn't be. The patterns of power and identity that we've examined show us both how much has changed and how much remains to be done. The legal equality that exists in Britain today is recent and remains contested in other parts of the world. The social acceptance that makes openness possible for some is still not universal. The institutional adaptations that allow someone like Ivar Mountbatten to marry openly are incomplete and face ongoing resistance. The work of creating societies where everyone can be fully themselves regardless of whom they love continues, informed by the history we've traced but not concluded by it. And with that, we've reached the end of this particular exploration. We've travelled from medieval courts where chroniclers carefully coded their observations, through Victorian drawing rooms where scandals were frantically suppressed, into 20th century social circles where sophisticated people maintained elaborate open secrets, and finally to the present where at least some visibility and openness has become possible. It's been a long journey through complicated history, and if you've stayed with me through all of it, thank you for your patience and your interest in these stories that have been hidden, coded, suppressed, and finally emerging into light. These stories matter, not just as history, but as part of understanding how we got to where we are and what still needs to change. Every person who lived authentically despite the risks, every relationship that persisted despite suppression, every moment of courage or love or simple human connection in the face of systems designed to prevent them, these all contributed to making possible the world where someone can now marry openly, where stories can be told honestly, where history can acknowledge what was really happening beneath the surface all along. The 25 royal figures we've discussed are just the beginning. There are more stories waiting to be discovered, more evidence yet to be examined, more patterns yet to be recognized. The work of understanding this history continues, and each generation brings new perspectives and questions to the sources. What we've done here is trace one thread through a much larger tapestry, showing how same-sex desire and relationships have been part of British royal history across all periods, existing sometimes openly, sometimes in code, sometimes in complete secrecy, but always there, always part of the human experience. So wherever you are right now, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, thank you for taking this journey through centuries of hidden history, complicated patterns, and ultimately human stories of love, desire, power, and identity. May you sleep well with new understanding of how much has changed and how much has stayed the same, how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Sweet dreams, and may your own story, whatever it is, be one you can tell openly and authentically in a world that continues to become more accepting. Good night, everyone. Rest well. And remember, history is always more complicated and more human than the official version suggests. The real stories are worth seeking out, worth preserving, and worth telling, even when they've been hidden for centuries.